All right, everybody, I do believe we are live. Welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules stream. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, at LevPo on Twitter. Today, we have Clint Russell, Steve Grumbine. We are going to be talking about MMT, Modern Monetary Theory, which I have heard various things about. I'm starting to get a little bit more into it, but I think it's very important for us to be very good faith when it comes to our various arguments, when it comes to the various ideas that we want to spread in the world, and I am just very flattered to have these two people in here talking about it. I want to go right into the super chats. As soon as we kind of pick this up, we have about an hour with the two of them, and then we are going to have very special guests. We are going to have Voluntary Keith coming in, aka Ann Capitalist, and we are also going to have Dr. Steve Armstrong coming in. So we'll see what this conversation brings. I'm very excited. Once again, sneed those super chats. Don't worry about the echo. That echo is history. I got rid of that tab. No need to worry about that. And once again, everybody, subscribe. So first, Steve, I want to find out a little bit more about what modern monetary theory is so we can have a little bit more of an establishment about this. What is modern monetary theory? And I want to make sure Clint agrees with you about that before moving on. So go for it. Sure. And also just tell a little bit about yourself, how you came into this as well.
Well, let me start with that part first, because that makes the rest of it much more, we'll set the stage just right. So I'm a former libertarian. I campaigned for Ron Paul. I was a W supporter before that, going through my Republican phase, which lasted quite a long time, unfortunately. But I was definitely a part of that world for a good bit. And then the global crisis hit, the global financial crisis back in 2008, 2009. And I was devastated by it. It literally kicked my ass from here to kingdom come. I had just gotten 2 master's degrees. I had a Master of Science and Technology Management and a Master of Business Administration. And so this whole world was looking insane. I had been extremely trained up in Austrian, trained up in von Mises, trained up in, praxeology, all the other good stuff from the libertarian angle, Creature of Jekyll Isle, all the other stuff that comes with it, kind of the handbook. And it didn't make sense. It wasn't adding up. It wasn't explaining things to me. And a friend of mine came to me back then and said, have you ever heard of modern monetary theory? And this is going way, way back about 10, 12 years ago. And I said, nope, never heard of it. And at first, I fought with him tooth and nail about it, and it didn't make sense to me because I was coming from a commodity money mindset, a gold standard mindset. I didn't understand this concept of fiat currency, not in the sense that I know it today anyway. And I started learning MMT. So MMT is largely what the textbooks stopped teaching after 1973. Is like all of our textbooks for economics are frozen in time before Nixon took us off the gold standard. And even those that have been written since then have largely been conjecture and sort of people making concepts and ideas and throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks. But modern monetary theory came along, and its entire purpose was to basically describe the monetary system and understand what happened in 73 and what that did in particular to the United States. But it allowed us to look at the world, see developing nations and understand their monetary systems, understanding the role of the central bank versus the conspiracy-laden stuff that I had learned and perpetuated for many moons. And then on top of that, it basically shows us what a sovereign currency issuing government can do with a free-floating fiat currency, and explains the plumbing. It's very boring. It just says this happens, and this happens, and it kind of describes the plumbing, the step-by-step process for how money money comes to be, the causes for inflation, what the framework is for what are the limits of spending, and such as that. So really, if you want to break it down, modern monetary theory is a lens that allows us to understand the way that money works in particular in a fiat currency environment. Someone like the United States has full sovereignty over the currency. They have the ability to spend money into existence to take care of anything that's for sale in US dollars. They can never go broke on debt denominated in US dollars. And we would say that the threshold for the economy's boundaries, if you will, is full employment. And depending upon what type of inflation, where your inflation's coming, inflation would be the other constraint. So political will is lacking. So a lot of what you see that people attribute to MMT today has absolutely nothing to do with MMT. People just think printing money and stuff, which is not an MMT thing at all once you get to learn the subject. So I would say that MMT is a lens. It's a description of how economics works from 1973 to present. Describes fiat currencies around the world, the UK, Australia, China, Japan, Canada. It describes the EU and it describes South America. It describes all nations and the various levels of sovereignty they have over their currency.
And just to be clear, before we go any forward, the specific debate would not even be so much as whether MMT exists as it is, more rather whether it should exist as it is. Whether that's the kind of system that, if properly implemented, would bring about the kind of changes that we want to see in the world. So, Clint, I would love to get your input on, first of all, if you agree with Steve's description of what MMT is and your particular problems with it. And also a bit of an intro as well for those who do not know who Clint Russell is. You are one of my favorite libertarian speakers of all time, first of all, but you are also a very business-oriented individual. I could tell by the beautiful backdrop. Not everybody is going to be able to have a kind of backdrop like that is not green screen. So you definitely are very smart with your money. And tell us a little bit more about you, as well as Liberty Lockdown, the podcast, the series, and all that.
Sure. By the way, gotta show my rooftop Koreans off. So I'm Clint Russell. I was is my audio okay?
Sounds perfect.
Okay, good. I was a private money mortgage broker for about 15 years, an entrepreneur doing as such for about over a decade, managing a couple $100 million. I actually started my career right along the same time that Steve's talking about, when everyone else was getting their teeth kicked in. So I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for that period. I was responsible for liquidating over 100 foreclosed properties and had to look some people in the eyes as I gave them cash for keys to get their properties and things like that. What I found fascinating about his tale, or his story arc, his character development, I guess, was that I look at that as really the proof of my case that boom bust cycle was created by central banking and all of the issues that he was experiencing during that period, that we all were experiencing during that period. It is a product of central banking and modern monetary theory, moreover. So I just think that's interesting. We can talk about that more later on, of course. To me, MMT is a deep-seated faith in technocratic governance, because central banks have a monopoly on the creation of fiat through their monopoly on state violence and taxation. They can never go bankrupt, as they would say, and therefore you can never escape their best laid plans. Proponents will also argue that managing this under kind of a socialist framework will benefit the poor, but in reality, you always run into the same problem socialists and communists always do, namely that the government ends up benefiting the politically connected and only doles out enough to keep the poor subdued so that they won't revolt. Through the Cantillon effect, the banks and the borrowers end up becoming enriched, and income inequality skyrockets. Inflation becomes an inevitable problem as politicians believe they can buy votes from both the poor voter as well as the financial titans which put them into office. The belief that this can last in perpetuity is disproven by all historical precedent. I think that we are experiencing the product of MMT today, where you see global inflationary pressures, but you also obviously have the lockdowns which broke supply chains. So I'm not going to put it all at the door of central banks, but it certainly plays a tremendous role. And anything else?
But you do agree on the definition that Steve gave. Like, there's no disagreement there as far as what MMT is, more so whether we should have it or not.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I'd be a fool to argue with his own definition of his own belief system. I think that that's certainly accurate.
So there we go. I would love to hear a response from Steve.
Well, first things first, the US dollar, let's just start with the US dollar. The US dollar is a patent by the government, the federal government, our government. It's an inch, it's a pound, it ends up being a tax credit. So this isn't about central banks going broke or not going broke. The United States government farmed out. It's just like, anytime you get a contractor of sorts, the United States government in 1913, and yes, we can all go back to the creature of Jekyll Isle if we so desire. I hope we don't do that because that's a snooze fest. But 1913, we created central bank in the United States because everybody was fighting for Billy Bucks over here, Joey Bucks over there, somebody putting their thumb on the scale, Bucks over here. And it was wild, wild west, and it was insane. And we were not clearing payments. It was an absolute bedlam. Okay. That's number one. Number two, this Cantillon effect. I want to just say for the record that MMT talks about a circuit. It doesn't talk about just endlessly printing money and pumping money into the system. See, that's kind of like a slur. That's like saying all this type of people do this and all this type of people do that. It's not true. That's not how it works. Taxation is literally the drain at the bottom of the bathtub that literally deletes money. It eliminates currency. So you're always either having to spend money into the economy through either being a net importer or a net exporter. There's cash coming in through the door that way. Flows come that way. Or you end up going into private debt through private banks where you and I go out there and borrow money from a bank. Or the federal government spends that money into the economy. Three ways. That's it. Okay, quantitative easing, which is typically what we look at the central bank for, is a debt swap. It's a liquidity swap. It's trading one form of debt to another form of debt. It's nothing more than that. It didn't create new money per se. It just changed the form of it. And so when you think about bonds and things like that, which make up the national debt, those things are done after the spending. We didn't rely on those bonds to fund the government. That's one of the big misnomers, the big aha moments you have once you start learning the cadence of how spending actually occurs. These bonds are an anachronism from a gold standard era. We could stop selling bonds yesterday, but watch the weeping and gnashing of teeth of the rich folk that enjoy their bonds and their basic income from that very, very secure, sure interest payment on those bonds. So ultimately, a lot of what Clint said is stuff that I once said when I was a libertarian. It's not stuff I would say anymore, but it's stuff that I once said. And I come from a group that worked with the regulators like Bill Black and others who worked on actually chasing the elite control fraud that brought on the 2008-2009 crisis. He actually went after the Keating Five and has been very instrumental in showing the actual elite control fraud that places like Countrywide, JP Morgan, and all these other groups have done. So if you want to say that we've got capture in our government, the answer is, dude, me and you are simpatico. If you want to say this is just the way MMT works, I'd say it's like telling somebody, here, grab a gun, put your thumb on the trigger and have it pointed back at you and great things will happen. That's what that is. And that's not how MMT is. That's not anything about MMT any more than, somebody taking a gun and shooting someone and saying all guns are bad, right? Well, that would be pretty stupid to say. The fact is that there was an asshole with a gun that did something really stupid, and therefore we should deal with that situation. MMT is something that requires, just like all systems require, a counterbalance of regulatory environments to prevent control fraud, to prevent certain monopoly behaviors from existing. We used to know what it meant to trust bust in this country back in Teddy Roosevelt's time. It's been a long time since we've been in the trust, but I guess you could say Judge Green when we broke up the Bell system. But even that, you've seen extreme consolidation. So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about has nothing to do with the government's ability to do these things. It has everything to do with a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of the central bank and who derives what authority from where. And this is one of those big aha moments that the former libertarian had as I transitioned from the Rothschild conspiracy and singing Rothschilds like Slayer's Tom Araya, just belting out Rothschilds and all this stuff. And it's like, if we really hate the Rothschilds, why don't we just bribe the butler and put a bar of soap in the floor of the tub and let him slip on it? We're done with the Rothschilds, right? We don't have to worry about them anymore. Just done. Spike the Earl Grey, something like that. But when it comes down to brass tacks about simple fiat, the federal government, Article 1, Section 8, gives the power of the purse to Congress alone. Article 1, Section 10 gives the states their marching orders, basically that you're a currency user. You cannot create US dollars. Only Congress has that authority by law. And what Congress does is they write a law. They create a bill. That right there gives the authority for spending money. That's it. That right there. That bill is then signed into law, handed to president or whoever. They sign it, and then they pass it over to the Fed. The Fed then in turn keystrokes deposits into the Treasury's account. The Treasury then spends that money into existence. It didn't exist 1 minute, and then it exists the next minute. And that's how all federal spending is done. Not some, not every once in a while, every single time. That's exactly how our federal government spends. And every time we receive a federal dollar back in tax, it's like the dark crystal. The light and the dark come together and they're gone. It's just gone. That's what happens when reserves are created on one side, received back as a tax, and they're purged. They're gone. So I think a lot of the discussion points that we'll have here, I once believed myself. I once carried that libertarian perspective. And while I certainly was never a mortgage banker, I was definitely the recipient of bad mortgages where there was some bad underwriting and stuff that created some significant financial troubles in my life. So I come from a different angle. You won't have the beautiful waterways behind me. You're just going to have a simple shitty flag behind me. So that's where I'm at.
Lev, we lose you?
No. Well, Clint, your response. I was very intrigued by what was talked about right now, but let me know what you think.
Well, I think it borders on the, it's not true socialism argument that this isn't what MMT is. I think that you're going to encounter that if you go down this path because of human nature, you're going to end up, this is not the same argument as saying that just having an inanimate object will end up with people dying. It's like, no, I'm saying that if you empower the state with this level of monopoly, it's just inevitable that you're going to have people at the top that are in control that accumulate more and more power, and they don't have any real reason to implement MMT, even in your best laid plans, in a way that would actually create the environment or society that you hope to create. And I think that's the same counter argument that I would have against socialism or communism, for that matter, is that it's the same issue. It sounds okay on paper, and then in reality, it's like, well, that's not what you get. You end up with starving people.
Just between you and me, I mean, because this is one of the struggles I have. Show me anywhere, where a libertarian paradise has ever come to be and worked out and stayed around. It hasn't. It hasn't.
You're right.
And what I'm here to say is this. Today, in this moment, MMT describes the way economics works. It describes the current system, but it also describes how it's being used incorrectly. Not even used incorrectly. You don't use MMT. It's like you could just see how stupid the people in power are, if they're stupid at all, if they're not really brilliant people that are actually doing exactly what they intended to do. See, I still have that libertarian streak in me. It's just that I understand the money system differently now, and so it's changed some things. We are currently finding ways to bomb the world left, right, and center without even flinching, right? I mean, we don't even think twice about it. We've got to, you want to increase the military? Not a problem. Because see, what's happened is this, and this is a real sticky wicket. The military gets unlimited funding. Why is that? Because everybody thinks this red, white, and blue thing, these colors don't run. You got Republicans that'll agree to it. You got Democrats that'll agree to it. Hell, you've even got some libertarians out there that occasionally get a wild hair and say, yeah, man, go USA. And the reality is that's the one place where they don't get enough pushback, and they can spend that money into existence to keep the bathtub of the economy full. Okay, they know as well as we know that if they allow that economy to shrink, it'll go into recession, then depression. And the only way for it to work in this kind of arrangement is for the federal government to subsidize various aspects of the economy with automatic stabilizers and things like that. When there's an event, like all of a sudden inflation hits X, maybe something triggers Y, or unemployment triggers X, and now all of a sudden we have unemployment insurance. Or maybe instead of unemployment insurance, maybe we have federal job guarantee where people can work, in a nonprofit or work doing something that they enjoy in their local community, but have it federally funded, locally administered. As a automatic stabilizer, these things ebb and flow with the business cycle, kind of like that counter-cyclical Keynesian approach minus the Keynes, because quite frankly, even Keynes got some things wrong. And I'm sure you definitely think that Keynes got a lot wrong, knowing Hayek and the gang. So I'm not in, not dismissing where you come from on that. But I will tell you that I think a lot of this comes down to what kind of society do you want, right? And so when you start thinking about that, I think back to the end of Rome, quite frankly. And as I watch as Rome itself started withering at the edges, you started seeing illiteracy take over at the edges. You started seeing warlords take over at the edges. And all of a sudden, at the edges of what was once great Rome, you suddenly had what I consider to be a libertarian paradise taking hold, where you had people in little factions, little warring factions, a lot of blood, a lot of violence baked into the system, and a lot of illiteracy and a lot of my facts versus your facts. And all of a sudden it starts devolving into this my opinion, my space, I'm the maker, I'm the taker, I'm Ayn Rand's best friend. And it just becomes this army of one. It stops being the communal aspect of society and it starts deteriorating. So as I think to myself with what do I want from MMT, because that's kind of where we were going here. You'd kind of mentioned, what kind of society you would want. And I say, judge a society by how it treats the least of its own. Judge a society by how it takes care of not just its poor, but its elderly, its indigent, people that are in need in general. Judge a society by that. And quite frankly, we're doing a very, very poor job of it. I'm not a Democrat. You're not going to see me cheering on Joe Biden, and you're definitely not going to see me cheering on Donald Trump or any of the others. Very much a MMT-informed leftist, as I would describe myself. But you're right about a lot of things there in terms of, there is a natural helium effect, if you will, to money. Money goes up to the top. It pools at the top. And then all of a sudden you get, in effect, what you see today where the government is not representative of the people. The people are left to languish. This is the neoliberal world that we live in, the neoliberal construct that has really, really given any kind of government a bad name.
A couple of things I wanted to cut in here, and I would love to hear Clint's response to all this as well. But one of the things that I started thinking about as you were talking about this structure is, number one, when you were talking about this idea of there being this libertarian paradise, equating it to all the horrible Mad Max things that may go on. At least the way I think of libertarianism is not in these extremes. If we have either like a full libertarian society or not. I know some people who are, let's say, closer to the Mises Caucus may disagree with me here. I personally see it as whatever is done to prevent the government from doing things that have been done, let's say, to my parents and their parents and so on in the Soviet Union, in the USSR, where you saw the worst government excesses that would make anybody who had to go through those problems just kiss the ground right now in the United States, regardless of any of its very corrupt problems that are going on. Those are kind of the extremes. So that would be one thing that I would want to introduce into here. And the second thing is, when you're talking about the federal government providing money for local things, one of the things that first occurs to me is, hey, wait a minute, if the federal government is creating these incentives that otherwise did not exist, would that not change the way local communities would function, where they would start to get used to this opium, so to speak, this, like Marx had opium to the masses, this would be opium of the federal government. So that would be my other question here. I would love a response to both as possible, but then I would love for Clint to also respond to what you said, as well as maybe to what I said. Everybody subscribe. But anyway, Steve, go for it.
Well, first things first, I would say that you can see the evidence of a crypto opium right now. I would say that crypto experienced what many would call hyperinflation, if that's your target there. Would it lose like outrageous amounts? People, the pumpers got plenty of money, and the dumpers got plenty of money, and the people left at the bottom got stuck holding the bag. I would say that, yes, there's extremes, but I would say that I believe that the idea of, hey, this river runs through my property, I can dam it if I feel like it, and to hell with you downriver if you needed water. I would say we've already seen a modern day version of that with people like Clive and Bundy. Okay, so we already kind of see what that flavor of thing brings to it, a sense of ownership, a sense of possession, a sense of private property over the needs of the many for the individual. And to me, I find that to be a real challenge in this space.
Wait, with Clive and Bundy, sorry to interrupt, but with Clive and Bundy, please, sorry if I get this wrong, wasn't it the case that the Chinese government had a certain amount of influence with what they wanted to do to that land? And that's kind of another thing that I would watch out for here when it comes to decisions the federal government would make, that maybe enough elbows get rubbed between the Chinese Communist government and certain officials here in the States, where that also becomes problematic to more local communities. But I don't know.
Well, first of all, China is like really not a communist government. They are very much a capitalist government. They kind of got a mixture.
Well, they're communists in the way that they go against people's rights and lock people in camps. They're communists that way.
That's totalitarianism. You're conflating totalitarianism with communism. I would recommend that you keep because you can look at totalitarian fascism, you can look at totalitarian, you can look at totalitarian neoliberalism, right? Totalitarianism is its own answer to things, right?
But this I think is the crux of the discussion, though. I want to go to Clint here because I think this is the crux of this very discussion. It's not about we don't want these wonderful things to happen to people. I'm sure all of us want the best things to happen to the people who are in the United States. The problem is that we don't want these things to lead to totalitarianism in the state being able to make decisions on behalf of regular people on what they are and are not allowed to do. So this is what I want to figure out. How much would the implementations of things that you want to implement lead to that? I don't know yet. This is why I want to get a Clint's take, and let's all figure this out together.
Sure. But I have a hell of a lot that was just thrown at me. So I'll start with going all the way back to 10 minutes ago when Steve was first talking about how I guess libertarianism is the end of the Roman Empire is this best example of libertarianism, which I find fascinating because we are currently in the end stages of another empire, the modern one of America, and I think that it's not at all libertarian. So I don't think that's really a fair comparison. But I also wanted to say that, if you're going to judge a society based off of how it treats its poorest, and you also simultaneously say that MMT is the way you describe our current economic model, that's your words, well then MMT is failing terribly because the poorest in this country are treated like shit. We have veterans and homeless populations that are exploding, drug use epidemic. It's like the entire foundation of our country seems to be crumbling. And I personally believe that it has to do with some of the ideas that you prefer with MMT. Moreover, I think that it's just the nature of a declining empire that you have cultural decay, you have illiteracy and sexual degeneracy and all sorts of things that start to propagate themselves. And we've seen so many empires go through this period at this point that it's like, yeah, I mean, I look around and I just think it's kind of a priori. It's like, yeah, that's what's happening. So I it's funny because I feel like we diagnose many of the same issues, but it seems as if you are prescribing what I view as the poison that is bringing it about. So I think that's interesting.
To me, the pursuit of individual goals and dreams and stuff like that at the expense of the collective is a real problem for me. And that's part of what caused me to really reassess my political ideology. I want to do something that you're probably not going to enjoy. It's not bad. It's going to be different than what you're expecting. I want to take politics, political ideology, and put that right over here, right? Political ideology it's got a whole bunch of things, has to do with power dynamics, has to do with perspectives and so forth. MMT is not political in any way, shape, or form. Although political beliefs would change how people use a state currency. Okay. When, if you're a Republican or a Libertarian and you suddenly got the White House and, you still had 2 houses of Congress there that weren't Libertarian, you would have to do some things that are different than what you think you do. You'd find out where your limits of power are and so forth. But the fact is that it would be very, very different. If a Libertarian was somehow or another appointed to the Federal Reserve as the chairman of the the board of the Fed, right? It would look very different than if a communist or a socialist or a democratic socialist or any number of things. Each one would take this exact, set. You have a bunch of wood on the ground. You got some paint cans. You got some nails. You got some shingles, windows, stuff like that. I go to put this house together. I may say, well, I'm going to build a flat house because I think flat houses can have a broader base to attract sun rays for, solar power. You may say, well, I like a tall one because a tall one does this. And, that'll be your ideological preference. That'll be your housing preference. Well, with this, it's like, what do I do with this hammer? Well, I want to build a really nice house. You may say, well, screw that, man. It's got a nice claw in the back. I would have beat someone over the head with it. The hammer, it's still a hammer. It's still the same hammer. You just used it differently. So if I have a Republican or a Democrat, let's just keep it real grassroots there, crap people running the show, you're going to get crap in, crap out. You know what I mean? And so from my vantage point, it is an uphill battle. The things I want are an uphill battle. There's no easy fight here. The things I want would be very, very different than what you see today. I don't support Joe Biden. I don't think Joe Biden represents anything about what I consider to be a quality future for people. Okay. And, at the same time, though, I think it's important to understand that if you're going to have a state, okay, and I'm not an anarchist, okay, so I'm going to have a state. I believe you need to have some means of organizing, okay. Even businesses organize lines of business. I mean, I think that organization is still key. Now, I would take that from a standpoint of having a visionary, kind of central visionary, and have democratically led implementation throughout, to spread that out and let them do what they want. I have a fundamental belief that there has to be a plan to some degree, that chaos ensues. And I think that what you're seeing right now is the complete fracture of what regular people think they want when they wake up in the morning and they go to bed at night, when they're hungry, when they're thirsty, when they're wondering where their next paycheck's going to come from, et cetera. They have different motivations that drive their behaviors. Okay. And so I think that conflating what a neoliberal regime is doing, and by the way, both Trump and Biden are neoliberals. Okay. Both of them are exactly the same with the different bedside manners, different approaches to things, but still the same basic pro-business, pro-Wall Street trash. I mean, like all fire sector all the time, both of them. They're not into producing anything. They're not into the welfare, if you will, of the general public. Both of them are very much into ensuring those who have money have more money, and those who have less money are pliable and malleable for those who have money to work for them. So I believe we've created a neo-feudal state, which is not anything that I would want. So you and I are probably, like, if we were walking down a plank and we were going to have to walk off the plank, you and I would go probably 7 or 8 clicks down before we got to our real serious disagreement. And that's when it starts being, well, okay, so now how do we form society the way we'd like to see it? How would we disperse money? How would we get these programs, or would we have programs, or how would we create a local community, a state community, a national community? Would we create those things? And, and anarchists would have a very different perspective than I would as well. So, I'm kind of sympathetic to all those different schools, having, done some deep dives in, Kropotkin and others on the, I've talked to Michael Albert and people like that are very, very much into the anarchist side. And obviously, coming from the libertarian side, Gary Johnson was one of the guys that I sort of followed for a little bit. I don't really think he was a fire-breathing libertarian, but he was definitely, had more libertarian roots than a lot of them. But I see a guy like Rand Paul and I say, dude, me and you don't have anything in common, like zero. Like he and I, it's like night and day.
Well, I want to make sure that we focus on the implementation here as far as Clint. If you were to look at this through the lens of what are the unintended possible consequences that could come about through, let's say, implementing MMT in the way that Steve would want to, even if it's well-intentioned, that may be the right thing to focus here. So go for it.
Yeah, well, let me start by saying, as much as he wants me to set aside politics, I don't see how you can. I mean, what you're describing is a central bank with a central government that is via technocracy deciding what all of us do, more or less. And I just don't see how you can separate that from politics. Like at its core, it's a belief in an extraordinarily strong central government with a monopoly on what I view as probably the most important economic signal, which is interest rate setting. And because we don't have real interest rates in this country or across the globe, and we haven't had them our entire lives, we have a tremendous amount of misallocation of capital. We have continuous boom-bust cycles that are creating the income inequality that he correctly laments, and I lament as well. I think that we share the same goals when it comes to wanting to lift up the poor and wanting to have people pursuing their dreams and things of that nature. I mean, there's no disagreement there. But I just strongly disagree that this plan is how you get there. This plan is how we got here. I mean, that's my honest opinion. Like we are deep down the path of a belief that deficits don't matter. We're 30 trillion plus in debt. I know you don't think they do, but how can you say that? I mean, we have so many
debt to who? For real. Debt to who? How do we go into debt? Let's talk about it. Let's hit debt straight on the head. How did we get in debt?
Well, we spent more than we brought in. That's pretty.
No. Okay, so what is debt? What is the national debt? Let's start there. Let's have a common definition of what the national debt is.
Well, it's the treasuries that they've sold, and it's how much they owe.
So think about it like this. China does business with the United States. I don't know how much money they bring and sell through the United States when they're producing their products and selling them in, and we're buying them, right? Because unless you want to cut off free trade, because I think that's a libertarian thing, unless you want to cut off that free trade thing, China's doing business with us. They have a model that has allowed them to export. They're an export centric country, and we are an import centric country. And now a lot of that has to do with dollar hegemony and the fact that we have set up a system using the WTO, IMF, and World Bank to basically gut and destroy developing nations in the global South and so forth. But that said, if you ask yourself, what is it that you're trying to get from this arrangement here, right? If you're really seriously trying to figure out what you're trying to get from this arrangement, you realize ultimately that all the debt is China having a choice. They've got 1 trillion, let's say, in money they've earned in the United States in US dollars. They're like, what the hell do I do with the US dollar? I use the renminbi or the yuan back home. What do I care about this dollar for? Well, I might need enough to buy gas and stuff like that. Maybe I want to use it to facilitate transactions in the United States. So they keep it parked at the Fed. Okay, now they have a choice. Do I keep it parked at the Fed, or do I buy treasuries at a nominal interest rate with the money I earned, the US dollars I earned that do me no good back home? Now I can sell them back to the market, and I can get a different currency that I want to hold for myself, that I want to save in. But ultimately, what ends up happening is China makes a choice. They have sold so much money or so much goods and services into the States, and they may choose to keep their dollar holdings right there. And if that's the case, it makes sense that they would pick up a savings account at the Fed, which is what we base the Treasury. That's what we're talking about here, right? A savings account for their already earned US dollars. We didn't borrow the US dollars. We didn't do anything like that. The reason why we sell Treasuries right now is to defend a positive interest rate, like you were saying. Okay. The Treasury, we don't borrow that money. That money's not ours. We don't care. It doesn't do anything for us whatsoever, other than quote unquote delay purchasing power. Okay. It's like kind of like a pause button in their ability, just like during World War II when we sold war bonds. We weren't using that money. Oh my God, we need money. How are we going to get money? Where are we going to get money from? No, all we did was we sold war bonds to delay people's purchasing power during the war. Right. And so ultimately, the national debt is the sum total of every untaxed dollar in existence today. That's it. So if you were to get rid of the national debt, you would basically wipe out the money supply. Okay. And really, it's just a fundamental lack of understanding, not your part per se, but everyone's part, right? That we have double entry accounting. On the one side, we have a reserve. On the other side, we have dollar creation spent in. When the dollar comes back, it wipes it out. It just zeroes it out, right? And if you look at sectoral balance, this is an accounting identity. It's not a guess. It's not ideological. Sectoral balances, aka stock flow consistent modeling. This is a fact. This is an accounting fact.
I can talk now.
Yes, Steve has been frozen in place. Hopefully we'll get to the connection back in. Everybody, by the way, add a like. It helps the algorithm. But yeah, I want Steve to finish his thoughts as well. But Clint, now that you have the floor, go for it. Add a reply.
Well, I hate to have him pop back in while I'm like mid-sentence and be like, well, hey, I was talking. Well, I disagree with so much of it. It's hard to even like... he talks so long and I can't even like remember the first thing I want to push back on. Well, first off, I don't buy at all that if you paid off the national debt, you would have no currency in circulation. I don't understand that. Like, I don't even understand how people argue that to be the case. I know Stephanie Shelton and other people of the MMT camp have made that argument, but I just don't think it's at all correct. I mean, you could absolutely pay off the national debt and still have money in circulation. So he'll have to come back and explain that one to me.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in Dr. Armstrong. Hopefully he's going to be able to come in here and talk about this a little bit more. But in general, I already made known my personal disagreements here. And I'm not saying that the things that he's talking about are not important. The MMT, you would agree that that's the way that things are running right now, that kind of system. But it's very weird for me to have people talk about there being some big plan, a plan of the people that the government would do, because my concern goes back to fear of the tyranny of the majority. That's something that I also want to, beyond talking about the debt, which I think is important. I want to focus on the whole tyranny of the majority part, because a lot of people have great ideas when it comes to we are going to help the people. But how do you know that the people are not going to institute some incredibly stupid thing with some loser at the helm, like we've seen all these California politicians? They're just a bunch of losers. But anyway.
Well, there's tyranny of the majority and there's tyranny of the minority. Either way, it's evil. And I think that we have both today because we have these aspects of democratic socialism where you have the tyranny of the majority voting to, rob and extort the middle class and the upper class. And then you also have the tyranny of the minority when it comes to the politically connected and the politically tied. So we have basically the worst of both worlds. And in my view, he's arguing for both. He's arguing that we should have democratic socialism as well as a monopoly on the currency for the politically connected and the most powerful people on the planet. It is a catastrophic combination that will result in exactly what we're experiencing today, which is inflation paired with economic stagnation, paired with societal decline and collapse. So I feel like I am really benefited by the time that we live in, that I get to, debate this topic, because I'm like, well, we are experiencing what you preferred, whether you want to admit it or not. You could say that it hasn't been implemented in the way that he wants. He can say that it's not perfect. It's not, we need to do X, Y, Z differently. The truth is we're a hell of a lot closer to his worldview than we are to libertarianism. And the reason we're suffering is because we're so far away from libertarianism.
And to update what's going on, there was a power outage. Apparently, there was a storm in his area, so he's trying to get back in. But we are definitely...
I got lightning in the backdrop, too, so hopefully I don't go out.
Well, we're definitely going to have Dr. Armstrong, Dr. Phil Armstrong, coming in just in a bit. So either way, we are going to be saved. There is no problem there. But
get in here, Keith Knight. I need reinforcements.
Yes, Keith could come in here as well. But also, I want to let everybody know that in about a week, on the 16th, we are going to have Pax Americana, Jeremy Kaufman, who I'm sure you know, versus Counterpoints, where we're going to be talking about the American hegemony, whether it is a force for relative good as opposed to relative bad. I mean, I'll be honest, Clint, you're probably not going to like me after I tell you a bit about what I think here. Because again, as somebody who came from the USSR, from Russia, looking at the situation that's going on right now, I really do like the U.S., and I'm always a bit apprehensive about when people talk about, well, if only the U.S. didn't have all these military bases here and there, everybody would be living in peace, holding each other's hands. And personally, I think that's bullshit. Not that I like...
It is bullshit. Of course.
Yes, you agree with them there, but when it comes to a lot of libertarian approaches to saying, well, we should, get rid of all these bases and we should only concentrate on the U.S. and, fuck whatever's going on in these other places, I completely understand that there is a military-industrial complex, that it does waste tons of money, and I wish that there was a way that it wouldn't. I just want to look at it from the perspective of what happens when there are certain gaps in power around the world, what ends up happening. And I'm not going to be one of these neocon fucks who just say that, well, we should spend exactly as we're spending, and I'm not going to criticize it. I think everything's perfectly fine. No, of course it's not. Of course there are a lot of problems. But that's the only thing that I'm going to kind of give here as far as an opposition goes, that if we take away a lot of this weaponry, these bases, these warships, what happens then when it comes to the rest of the world, including China and Russia? That would be my big thing. I just wanted to let you know that we're going to be talking about that ad nauseum on the 16th.
Jeremy can handle it himself. He'll do a great job. He's brilliant. I mean, he is really brilliant. So prepare yourself for him, because he's going to come with a anti-war fire. But I just to be on the record, I agree with you. Like, it would create a power vacuum if the U.S. empire were to crumble and we were to withdraw from the globe. Like, there would be additional wars. There would be skirmishes as the power gets reallocated. So you're right to have concerns. I just think that we are an empire in decline, whether we want to admit it or not, and we're going to see that come to pass, and it would be better if we do so without a nuclear holocaust.
I agree with you there. And we got Steve back in. There's a bit of a glitchy sound going on in your background. I'm not sure what that is. Whoa. There is some weird glitchiness going on with you right now, Steve. I'm just hearing like this flash in the background. We are going to handle it. While we're handling it, I want to ask everybody who's watching, if you guys are enjoying this, patreon.com/breaktherules. Become a patron today. I guarantee you are going to love these beautiful wooden magnets. Look at the state of these magnets. Maple, mahogany, ashwood, cherry. My incredibly talented father, Alexander Polyakov, created these magnets, and they could be yours for the $20 tier. And for the $50 tier, you are going to have a custom magnet. Whatever design you want, it is going to be given to you. And of course, the $5 tier, not only are you supporting the show, but you're also going to get MP3s of the episodes after they come out. And you are also going to have a chance to be on the streams as well when we have a particular guest that you would want to be on. You have carte blanche to come in and enjoy the show. So once again, patreon.com/breaktherules. Become a patron today. Steve, let's turn the volume back on. Let's see what's going on, buddy. Oh, you are muted right now. Unmute yourself, please, and we are going to continue.
Is that working? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah. It's a little bit loud, but it should be fine. I can adjust it, just make it a little bit less loud, and we're good. But anyway, I would love. Yes, Clint, now is your time to shine as far as the response. So we talked about the debt. You can talk about the debt, but then I really want to get things back to the tyranny of the majority thing that I was talking about.
Sure. I just wanted to make a quick point. Honestly, I've forgotten because it's been a while as to what. It's okay. It happens. But I did want to make one comment on something that you brought up that I care about tremendously, is that I am very anti-war, and I think that it's an important point to make that central banking, by its nature, and I'm sure you'll admit this is correct, that oftentimes when a country goes to war, they will disconnect themselves from convertibility towards any sort of precious metal, be it gold, silver, whatever. That's oftentimes how we get off of a gold standard or a commodity-backed currency, is that the state wants to wage war. So from the libertarian perspective, that's a tremendous argument not to allow the state to do so. I'm curious how you envision us not having endless war without being connected to any sort of commodity currency.
Well, I think that commodity currencies create wars because you got to ultimately get the gold from somewhere, right? And I think that a lot of wars have come from resources in general, real resources, commodity resources. So, I see wars as typically being resource extraction, market creation wars. I don't see a lot of wars for, stopping, the bad guys. I see a lot of wars just being about clearing markets, making countries that don't have a lot of options suddenly see the United States in particular as a great option. Hey, suddenly, these guys are offering us loans. We're from the IMF and we're here to help, kind of thing.
But we have disconnected from gold-backed money, and yet we have had, consistent war our entire adult lives.
I'm going to go back to the beginning, right? If I allowed Rand Paul to be president, I would die to stop to prevent Rand Paul from being president. But if Rand Paul were to be president, Rand Paul would do various things that would be very different than, say, your guy Karl Marx or Stephanie Kelton or Warren Mosler or Phil Armstrong, my good friend Phil.
Welcome down to Armstrong.
Yeah. Can you hear me, by the way?
I hear you quite well, mate.
All right, good. You continue, Steve.
Well, I'll be short-winded here. I've been long for a while, but my glitching here, we had a thunderstorm pass, took me right out. So I appreciate everybody being good sports about that. But again, ideologically speaking, groups do things ever since the end of World War II. Okay, the United States has been hell-bent to stop and stifle Uncle Joe, as in Stalin. The everything that we did was about preventing the spread of communism. The IMF was there to create loans for these developing countries to get ahead of Joseph Stalin spreading communism. The World Bank, same thing. All these groups, the Peace Corps, for goodness sake, was there to prevent Joseph Stalin from spreading communism throughout the world. I wonder what would have happened had we not been so egalitarian in our pursuit against communism, whether or not life might be different. I don't know.
Well, I can give you an example. There's a place that I know of called, New Transnistria. I don't remember exactly how you say that place. I'm going to look it up. But it is located in Moldova, and currently the Russian government occupies it. When before I said about totalitarianism, and you said, well, communism, not totalitarianism. For me, it's more about what is a particular totalitarian government end up doing once it has the keys to power, wherein I see something like communism as being a very comfortable in to bring about a lot of this totalitarianism. When I take a look at that particular state within Moldova, it is quite literally a shithole as far as the agriculture goes, as far as jobs go, as far as just the state that people live in. And we recently had a former FSB member who was in charge of the accidental knocking down of that Malaysia airline, back in Ukraine, who went on the air and started talking about how wherever this government ends up going, it turns everything into complete rubbish. And I think that is a legacy of having to be under this totalitarian state, of having people be subdued. The last thing that I say, and I really want to bring this back to Clint, when you were talking right now about, well, if Clint had his guy in, it would be different than if you had your guy in. To me, that's the same argument that at least I keep hearing from reactionaries, from far-right reactionaries who talk about if only we had a monarchy, where we would have a benevolent dictator who would do all the things that we want that dictator to do, but maybe not our neighbor, maybe not this guy. So that is a thing that I come back to when it comes to our very, horrible system that we're currently in today, where things of that nature are not able to manifest themselves in such a way that I think a lot of people who live in the United States or the Western world have no idea what it's like to live under these kind of conditions. So I just want to throw that in again as being the guy who came from that situation and his family came from that situation. It could get way, way, way worse than you expect. But anyway, I want Clint to respond. Go for it, Clint.
Well, I just wanted to say I don't feel as if we've actually dealt with my point that the government did disconnect itself from gold-backed currency because it wanted to wage endless war and it wanted to have the MMT path of being able to spend endlessly. And I just feel that it's an obvious point that needs to be dealt with by MMT advocates that if you are anti-war and MMT, you are basically self-defeating. You're enabling the state to propagate endless war because of your economic model. Whereas if the whole reason that they throw off the tie to gold is because they realize that they can't do it without doing it. Otherwise they would, or they wouldn't rather. So how do you deal with that issue?
You think about this for just a second, right? The robber barons, I mean, the gold standard, the living La Vida Loca gold standard style. I mean, you've got a small group of people that hold all the wealth, and then they end up dictating the terms of the economy privately, though, mind you, without any kind of potential of elections and things like that. I mean, this is one of the real challenges of not understanding that, first of all, MMT doesn't have anything to do. What that is, it's a political matter for real. Like when I say political matter, this is where we need to fight ideologically for what kind of society we want, because MMT can make you a libertarian society, or it can make you the most wonderful, utopian, whatever society that you want. It really comes down to what you value. Okay. And so ultimately it's a matter.
I'm sorry, I have to stop you there. There's no way you could have an MMT society with a libertarian society, because it's anathema to our belief system that you would even have a central bank, much less complete deficit spending that you don't have to worry about.
So get rid of the central bank. So you have it in the treasury. Who cares? This thing you fantasize about with the central bank, honestly, you could boil the functions of the central bank down to a spreadsheet. It's literally not as sexy as we try to make it out to be. It is definitely one of the big aha moments I had after I got out of the libertarian world and the creature from Jekyll Isle mindset. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the central bank, it manages interest rates, like you said. What if we had a zero interest rate policy period, got rid of bond sales altogether, and simply allowed the government to do what it does? And the government being we the people. Now, mind you, I know that's I mean, I can laugh with you for that, because I could think Phil could laugh at you with us as well, because in the UK with Boris and in the United States with the tragedy we have and continue to have, it's real easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater and not recognize that a gun in one person's hands gets him dinner for the table. A gun in another person's hand leaves 19 children dead in an elementary school. I mean, to say that MMT has to answer for why Joe Biden is incompetent, or to say why Donald Trump is an idiot with small hands and a tiny winky or whatever, who cares? Bad comb over. It doesn't have anything to do with the monetary system. Monetary system is a creature of who operates it, right? The United States, we should have a direct democracy. I'd kill for that. I'd love to have direct democracy. We don't have that. So
you don't believe in tyranny of the majority? That was the thing I was talking about when the thunder struck. But I am curious what your take is on tyranny of the majority, and I would love to get from Clint as well.
It's a thing, and I'll be honest with you, the majority in this country have been so propagandized already that things they think they want, if they understood what they were actually asking for, they wouldn't ask for it. But they've been propagandized, and you could see it clearly in television, in the newspapers, and your comic books, even the freaking comic books, pump your head full of shit.
But then how could you be for direct democracy?
Well, part of the problem here is that we don't have equal access to information, right? We've got 5 media companies that are oligarchs that control all the information flows in and out. I mean, this is literally a hellscape. I mean, this is not what I know. It's not what I want. I know it's not what any of my friends on the left want. It's not what you want. It's not what you want. I mean, we're all sitting here nodding. We're saying yes. The difference is that I'm telling you that a gun in the hands of a hunter is going to put dinner on the table. You're telling me it's impossible. I've got to answer for the kid that killed 19 kids.
We have a lot of, and I want to get to Clint real fast, but we have a lot of access to information already. If I want to, I can download the greatest works of literature that have ever been written. So my reason being is that there was a comment over here saying that this is from Not Sure. Direct democracy is ruled by idiots. My problem is that most people are not going to take the extra steps to become wiser, to learn. And most of them, when you just show them something shiny, like a shiny little rattle, and say this is the solution to all your problems, they're going to go with it. It's an extremely dangerous notion, in my opinion. But Clint, I'm not going to talk anymore. We have Keith Knight and Phil Armstrong in here. Clint and Steve, I would want the two of you to go for it a little bit more. I know it's 3:31. Steve, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you could stay just a bit longer. Clint, go for it. I'm going to zip up. Everybody subscribe.
Well, I'm not a fan of democracy, so I think that I would agree with your description of it being tyranny of the majority. Like I said, Steve was off air. I think that we exist in the worst of both worlds. We have tyranny of the minority when it comes to those that are closest to the central bank, be big corporations, politicians, things of that nature, military industrial complex. And then on the flip side, we have tyranny of the majority because we are inching closer to kind of some sort of democratic socialist model. So I'm a million miles away from any sort of political model that I would want. I do think it's interesting that you describe it as, this being such a problem with information in this country, because in my opinion, as someone who seeks out, independent creators and things like that, there has never been a better time to actually get as much information that's unique and independent and fresh. And like, it's what's that?
Data. It's just blah. It's just noise. There's just so much noise. It's
I'll grant you that it's very hard to get the signal through the noise, but it's also we've never had more options. But I will agree with you that I equally lament how few corporations manage the biggest avenues of data, the censorship issues that exist on social media, things of that nature. It's all a huge problem. But I'll let Keith hop in here and tell us what he's thinking. I don't even know if he heard the first hour.
I did not get access to the first hour.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Are we going into opening statements, Lev? Is there something you want me to comment on?
So I believe so. I just want to make sure that Steve, I really want you to stay for as long as you can. I understand that you have a kind of a fixed schedule here, but if there is anything that you want to say before you leave, whether it's now or whether it's after Keith, let me know whatever's best.
Well, let me. I do have to cut short. So I first of all, I want to thank all of you. I really appreciate the Vine. This was very cordial, very nice, great setting. And Keith, it's been a while, but I really appreciated you having me on your show a while back. That was very awesome. I just want to make the point that MMT is not political. It really isn't. I mean, you can use it's a lens to take what you're thinking and analyze and make decisions, right? But it in and of itself is not political. So I want to be crystal clear that it's as political as plumbing is political, right? Now, what you put down the pipes, that's a different story. What I want to make the point of for anybody that's trying to understand MMT is literally how it works today, minus the lies you hear from the news media, literally minus the lies from the news media. Even people that don't like MMT, even people that hate MMT, acknowledge that MMT is saying it correctly. So to deny MMT is really a fool's errand, right? Now, and Clint has said to me point blank, hey, I have no reason to disagree with his belief here, okay? However, it's not how I would want it to be. And that's a fair statement. It doesn't mean that I agree or disagree. It just means that we're not disagreeing on the fact that MMT is. What we're disagreeing on is how it's interpreted, how it's leveraged, how it's also explained in public to people. I mean, most times you hear people say they're just printing money. That drives me out of my effing mind. I mean, that's probably the worst thing you could say. It's a lie, number one. It's not true. But understanding it's a circuit, it's describing a circuit, spending money in, taxing it out, spending it in, taxing it out. So naturally, the idea of the other one is debasing a free-floating currency. It's just, that's another impossibility. They're not one and the same. You can debase a fixed exchange or a commodity-based money, but you cannot debase a free-floating fiat currency. It's simply not possible. And I'll let Phil will probably touch on that a bit.
Can I ask one follow-up question on that?
Sure.
I know that the way you guys fight inflation is through taxation. That money is allegedly no.
Mm-mm.
Okay, well then my premise is wrong. But it was my understanding that if prices get out of control, that you just increase taxes so that you can bring in more of that money. That money is then destroyed, and then the inflation is curbed.
No,
totally
no.
false.
See, so you, first of all, this is the other thing. Let's disabuse this. Milton Friedman's quantity theory of money. This has been the boogeyman since the OPEC crisis in the 70s. Milton Friedman and the Mount Pelerin Society and that whole gang, the Chicago School, ran game on all of our minds. The fact is that when you look at inflation, right? Inflation comes in many different flavors. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Sometimes it's a supply issue, like we saw with the supply chains. Sometimes it's interest rate driven, like we see when we do the Volcker method of jacking interest rates up to the roof. That'll create inflation. Now, it won't necessarily stop inflation. It will just kill the economy and cause people to get laid off, and then they'll have their fancy 5% unemployed, and now they'll all be happy again because that's what their model does. But
wouldn't that be deflation?
Excuse me?
If you skyrocket interest rates, which they did in the 80s, we had a deflationary spiral, not an inflationary.
Well, that's once the layoffs start occurring. That's once you kill the economy, then that stuff starts happening because then people can't buy anything, right?
Right.
So that's the goal here, right? But you have to. The point is that the range of interest rates, you've got to go so far to the moon to make it stick, to cause that problem to happen, that you end up literally killing the economy. And I know Phil can answer this. I've got to go. Phil, it was so good to see you, man. I wish I could have hung around with you more, brother. And Clint, I definitely like to talk to you offline sometime.
Yeah.
I think we got a nice enough rapport that we could have a legitimate conversation.
Well, before you go, where could people go to find you?
Yes, thank you. So I do a podcast released every Saturday morning called Macro, the letter N, cheese. So Macro and Cheese. And you can find that on our website. It is look at me gauging myself there. It's realprogressives.org is under the media drop down. You can find us on any of the normal podcast channels. And I also host a show Monday, Wednesday, Friday called The Rogue Scholar. I do that at noon. And then Tuesday and Thursday nights, I'm usually on with Jordan Cheriton over at Status Quo.
Nice. Well, Steve, thank you very much for being. It was a great pleasure to have you on.
You got it. Thank you, guys. I appreciate all of you.
Thanks, Steve. Nice to see you.
Take care. And if you guys are enjoying the conversation, don't forget to subscribe right now. Add a like. The like is very helpful for the sake of the algorithm. So do it right now. Subscribe. Anyway, Keith Knight, Phil Armstrong, it is a great pleasure to have you guys both here. And I would love to keep the conversation going as far as where we take this. I want to focus back on the economics here for a second. So, Keith, let me know what your opinion is on MMT, and then I would love to get a response from Phil as well. But as always, intros. So, Keith, please let everybody know about who you are, what you're doing, all that good stuff.
My name's Keith Knight. I am managing editor at the Libertarian Institute. My podcast is Don't Tread on Anyone. My basic critique of MMT. There are so many parts of it which we can disagree on, but what really gets to the heart of it is this double standard that one group, the state, does have the right to monopolize the currency, and anyone who doesn't use that currency can be threatened with prison, and if they refuse prison, they will be shot by the police. So they like to stand outside when it's risky, but when they can pick on the innocent, well, then they find the courage they previously didn't have. So when it comes to this double standard, imagine me saying, I think the Koch brothers and the Catholic Church should have a monopoly on the money supply. This way we could have things for free, and they can print money. And basically, they don't even have to print, actually. They could just enter the digits into our bank account. And then we'd have free Catholic Church school. Now, not anyone could have a school. You'd have to, get a license from the Catholic Church. Well, immediately, these two facts alone, monopolizing the money supply and compulsory education, or just controlling education through the funding method, what would this do? Obviously, it would increase the amount of Catholicism in society. So when the state monopolizes it, it is no surprise that we see an increase in the ideals of statism. The idea that I can't handle things on a voluntary basis, I must delegate my interactions to a third party who uses coercion instead of persuasion. This makes us all less civilized, and it diminishes our creative abilities because we're not dealing with influencing each other on a value for value basis. I can't get a penny out of Phil Armstrong's pocket unless he voluntarily gives it to me. I can't get a second of Phil Armstrong's time unless he voluntarily gives it to me. With the state, that standard goes totally out the door. So what are the major implications of this monopoly? Well, as Mr. Grumbine said previously, look at what happens when you have an oligopoly in the media. You get worse quality and higher prices than you otherwise would have. Well, the same thing happens when an organization monopolizes the currency. Are there any examples? Now, this is very much about how do we help the poor and the downtrodden. Well, here I'm going to cite from the Dallas Federal Reserve. I was hoping Mr. Grumbine would be here for this because I know it's his favorite organization. Here are the percentage of households, all households in 1970 compared to poor households in the year 2005. How do we help the poor? The answer is libertarianism. The reason I know this is because an increase in access to the following goods and services have included washing machine, clothes dryers, dishwashers, refrigerators, stoves, microwaves, televisions, DVD players is actually on here, personal computers, telephones, cell phones, and air conditioning units. How do we make the poor better off? We increase their ability to make voluntary exchanges with producers. Obviously, we see this when it comes to voting. Imagine you have to take 20 tests and you have to have 30 licenses if you want to vote. Well, Jeff Bezos will be able to vote, but not many of the rest of us will. So embracing the concept of statism and assuming they have the right to regulate voluntary interactions between consenting adults leads to oligopolies. Oligopolies give us higher prices. That gives employees less options of where to work. That means wages are lower than they otherwise would be because we've embraced the fundamental error of modern monetary theory that one group, the state, has the right to monopolize the currency. So both morally and economically, modern monetary theory fails because it increases the supply of money without caring about an increase in the products and access to products and goods and services to those at lower income levels. That's the first half of my statement. I will let Mr. Armstrong reply.
All right. Well, Dr. Armstrong, take it away.
Can you hear me all right? Have I got the echo? Or...
Yes,
sir.
Everything is good.
Result, I won't speak as fast as Keith. I mean, boy, he can go at some pace. So I'm going to have to congratulate you on that. I'm a bit more slow and steady. Now, first point I would make, Keith, thank you. You're confusing two things, in my opinion. You're confusing what is and what ought. Right. Now, MMT just describes what is now, what happens in the monetary system. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing is, you kind of may disagree that it describes with what's actually happening now. I get the feeling just from what I'd picked up earlier that many of you guys kind of agree the MMT's describing the system as it is, but you just don't like the system. You want a different system other than the one we've got now, which MMT describes. Now, most of the people like over in England, they tend to disagree with me about MMT describing the system. Now, so the first point I would make is MMT describes the system as it is now. Now, I know Clint made a point. You can't have MMT if you're a libertarian because you want to get rid of the central bank, you know. Now, that's an interesting point. But if we just took libertarianism, or what I see as people who are antagonistic to the state, right? I would say, and you guys will be able to tell me if I'm wrong, they would like to see a very small state. So in other words, the state commands a very small amount of real resources, the minimum, right? Now, if I come back to Clint or Keith, you might give me a figure. You might say, well, you know, the state should run the army, the law. Well, that's it, nothing else, maybe. So you'd have some sort of minimum figure that the state should actually do. So if you were an MMTer and you said, right, okay, we're a libertarian, we're in a very, very small state, all right, we do all the things you guys want, you know, we'd get rid of the government, we reduce the government to a minimal size so it just runs the military, say, all right, and just runs the criminal courts. And say that was 5%. So what you do is you would have like, you would spend, the government spending would be very, very low, obviously. So like 5% of GDP, but you just have even lower taxes. All right. So your taxes might be like 1%, and you might end up giving people rebates. So in other words, your deficit would still float to enable full employment, but your state would be minute. Do you see what I mean? Now, if you're a democratic socialist like me, however, that's separate from MMT, I like a bigger state, personally. So I would say, like, I come from England. I had life-saving surgery, all right? So I go to the doctor. He says, you know, you need surgery. You know, you got cancer. All free. Money's not into it. You know, I don't have to worry about insurance and advertising, nothing like that. It's all free. My surgeon's a very, very good man. I met him. He did it all for nothing. I'm still here 3 years later. Results. Now, that's socialism. But that's a different thing. So you don't worry about healthcare because it's all free. Now, I come back. So what I'm saying is, in principle, if you take libertarianism to mean a very, very small state, all right, forget so much about the institutions. I take Clint's point about you don't want a central bank. You want to go back to free banking, like, you know, if they had it in Scotland in the 18th century or something. You could have, ironically, a libertarian style people that accept MMT, possibly. Now, my view, obviously, MMT, it describes the system as it is. And it does, and you're right, Keith, it does involve the state having a tax liability imposed on the population. And that comes first. So that's how the state provisions itself. So the question really is, and this is a more a philosophical question, do you want a state to provision itself? Do you want a health service provided by the state, free at source? Do you want public schools provided free to everyone, like we have in England? Not saying England's perfect. All right. Now, for me, our National Health Service, it's the best thing we've got in the UK. You say to me, what's the best thing Britain ever did? The National Health Service. 1946. All right. 47, when it's introduced. Before the war, child mortality was through the roof. It was hard. They fought it. Boy, they fought it. So, consequently, I believe in democratic socialism, but I'm a libertarian socialist. So I don't believe in big businesses capturing the state and things like that, which I would agree with you guys on. But nevertheless, I believe in a state which is large enough to provide the things that we need, like healthcare, education, this sort of thing. I believe that free market, I believe that private individuals should have the right to run their own businesses, to make profits, to look after their families, fine, provided they obey rules regarding the environment, green issues, protecting their workers. Those rules are set by democracy. Point that, you know, Clint said he doesn't agree with democracy. I don't think it's perfect, but it's the best we've got. All right, so it ain't perfect, it's the best we've got. So democracy, through the ballot box, sets the rules. Businesses obey them. And the crucial thing is this. Vital. You have the state stands ready to offer every individual ready, willing, and able to work a guaranteed job at a fixed rate. Because if society is very efficient, so once you've got people in the public sector, whatever it is, yours will be very small, mine will be big, then the rest's employed by the, you know, the private sector, doing whatever the private sector does. If anyone's ready, willing, and able to contribute, they should be able to get a job. The state should give them a job. There's plenty, always plenty to do. So you make firms compete. If you had a floor rate, $12 an hour, $15 an hour, whatever, with good conditions, the private sector would have to compete with that. So you won't get poverty, because if you're trying to pay a guy $13 an you know, $10 an hour, so, well, I can get $12, I'm going there. Now, if a business says, and this is crucial, I can't afford to run my business if I have to pay my workers $12 an hour, you are a rubbish business. There's no charities here. If you want to run a business, you have to beat that. If not, you're no good. I teach. If I'm no good at teaching, boot me out. If you're playing running back, you know, in American football, if you're no good, you drop the ball, they'll boot you out. If you're a no good business, you can't deliver a good product, protect the environment, provide at least, I'm going to pick a figure, random, $12 an hour. Your history, my man. Forgive my American accent. So I lived in America for a year. So that's my view. So firstly, MMT describes what is, and I, with reservations to what Clint said, do believe that you could be a libertarian of your top, someone who doesn't believe in a big state and still accept MMT. And also on a separate point, because I am a socialist, I do believe that we judge a society in how it cares for the poor, and only the state can do that effectively. If you start relying on individuals' generosity, anything can happen. And I've been to America, and the income disparity there between rich and poor is unbelievable. You know, well, I'm not saying Britain's perfect. We've got a lot of faults. We've got a crazy prime minister. He doesn't know his backside from his elbow. You know, I mean, this guy makes Trump look a genius, you know, is Johnson. Well, it's a bit, maybe you're pushing it. So at the end of the day, politically, you know, I appreciate talking to you guys, and obviously I'm over the pond. I've got different political views to you, but I just think you got MMT wrong. And I'll be quiet now, Lev.
And Keith, I would love to get an answer from Keith. A very quick thing I just wanted to say again, being the USSR guy, that was an old joke among the Soviet workers. We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us. But anyway, with that out of the way, Keith, go for it, brother.
When it comes to whether or not people who are no good should be in business, sure, I would not like that. The problem is not what, but who is going to decide. For example, you're a teacher. I spent thousands of hours working at school for $0.00 an hour. That sounds a little bit lower than $12 an hour. So why did I do it? Well, that was me making a choice. Well, assume kids can't consent. Let's just talk about my college years. I chose to do that as a time investment at $0.00 an hour while the teachers were making six figures. Talk about exploitation. We talked about the Pythagorean theorem, I don't know, 12 years in a row. If anyone is exploitating, it is the state, who says we get to take money without your consent. Imagine if a business were able to issue taxes, and in exchange, the business will stimulate the economy by spending the money, of course. If you wanted make sure people who are no good aren't in business. Make sure you have a system that allows us to disassociate with bad actors. Only the libertarian does that. Everyone else says, well, this group, the state, you have to go with this group. The libertarian says that as evil as some of these people are, they don't get our money unless they create value in exchange. Or you can have charities, or you can have what I don't know how popular this is in England, but places like GoFundMe and Kickstarter and Indiegogo, where people voluntarily pool their money together to help the poor. When it comes to something being free, for example, you said the NHS is free. This is not true. That is equivalent to saying that the military is free because the government pays for it. That would mean that the nurses don't get paid, the doctors don't get paid. Obviously, you have the opportunity cost of the state monopolizing the product, which means you have worse quality than you otherwise would. You also have the cost of taxing people, of printing money, making... I know we disagree on this, but I'm just saying when you increase the supply of something, you decrease the amount of value it otherwise would have. The reason I don't support democracy is because it gives stupid, immoral, unaccountable people much more power than they otherwise would have. This microphone and this phone and this computer and this printer I have are not good because we had some mass vote. It's because some people specialized and competed with other people and voluntarily offered others the option to purchase it if they so desire. And then if those people are rewarded with dollars so they could invest more. And if we don't like it, we can allocate our dollars elsewhere. But to say the state provides it and it's free and universal is the equivalent of, not sure how bad the police situation is in Europe, but it's like saying the police are free and everyone gets police services. Well, the police do a very poor job. Very often, crime goes up and the police don't go out of business. They get more money. If the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, FDR gets more money and more power. When Al-Qaeda attacks America, George Bush got more power. When they don't do their job and the amount of money and resources they have increases. This is the great disincentive. It's the equivalent of saying, well, school is paid for by the state, therefore it's free, and therefore everyone's educated. The state controls the court system, therefore everyone has justice. No, the state monopolizing something, not only is it not free, but it also isn't universal. It doesn't mean everyone gets it. In the case of America, we've had the biggest increase in state intervention in housing, secondary and primary education, and in healthcare. In healthcare, we've had Medicare, we've had Medicaid, we've had Food and Drug Administration, the regulatory agency, expansion, and we've had the ACA, which is laughably actually called the Affordable Care Act. Since then, healthcare prices, you'll be shocked to find out, have increased because they've stifled competition and given consumers fewer prices, fewer options than they otherwise would have. This is what makes prices higher than they otherwise would be. This hurts the poor far more than anything else. Also, democracy is subject to what is referred to as the iron law of oligarchy. So we might say, well, in the free market, some people can get a lot of power. Well, let's take Jeremy Corbyn's as the example of what a democratic socialist might be. How many of Jeremy Corbyn's supporters have as much power as Jeremy Corbyn? Certainly, it should be equal among him and all of his supporters. Well, the iron law of oligarchy tells us that in any situation, very few people will have the persuasion skills to rise to the top, the ideas to rise to the top. So even in pure democracy, people who are the best persuaders are going to have the most amount of power. Therefore, immediately you have a power differential under any system. Some people just are not that interested in doing the research, in going to the meetings. The typical case is of the union, where you could have 1 million people, but only a few 100,000 go to the meetings. Only a few thousand of those really follow along. Only a few thousand of those speak up and really get their voices heard. And you end up with a few union bosses having more power, having much more power than all of the others. So democracy does not mean equality, nor does it mean high quality in the product or service that results from democracy, because you are still dealing with economics. Economics being the study of the use of scarce resources that have alternative uses. So for every school that a group called government gets to build, that's one school that the Church of Scientology didn't get to build. So if we gave all that money and power to the Church of Scientology, we might say, hey, look, they're giving us free schools. What they're actually doing to channel the wisdom of Otto von Bismarck, is they're intentionally making you more reliable on the state than you otherwise would be. The prosperity that exists in the world is in spite of people using initiating violence against peaceful people, and it is the result of voluntary cooperation.
Just to be clear, though, Keith, we're talking about MMT. I want to make sure that we understand each other. Right now, you're mainly criticizing socialism as opposed to MMT. Just
okay.
so we're...
Well,
yeah.
Mr. Armstrong did say he was a Democratic.
No, which is fine.
I just
don't have a problem
give
with
a point on for Keith. Because he's an interesting guy.
Whoa,
Keith, and
something's going on with
getting
the...
a little feedback.
Yeah, there's a little bit of fuzziness.
Can you? Is that better?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Keith is a sort of guy. If he'll be dreaming now, if he had a time machine, right? If you could go back to England in the early 19th century, this is what people said. Trust me. What they wanted was a free market system. And Britain, I know it's hard for you guys to believe, there was a time, just take a moment to reflect on this, when Britain was the world's greatest industrial power. We were the hegemon, if you like, before the US took over. Now, libertarians in Britain, although they are a smaller group than in the US, they idealized the 19th century because, in a way, it was like what you say. The state was incredibly small. I mean, as a percentage of GDP, didn't really exist. It didn't produce anything. It was a very small part of the economy. It was all about free entrepreneurs doing what they want and being competitive. It was if you look at it, you'll often get, Austrian school economists, and they love that idea. Guys thinking of great ideas, railways and everything else, being competitive. Now, the issue, though, in England was that before 1834, certainly, if you were poor and a pauper, you had to stay in your village. Vagrancy was a crime. But that's no good, because in capitalism, early capitalism, you need people to move to the cities to work. There's no unions, to work 80 hours a day, and children are in the, working. They're working in factories. Now, the problem with this is it sounds great. A lot of the things you say, well, not to me, but to people who are kind of not as old as me and don't realize what free market capital. There's no such thing as free market capitalism. All markets are designed by an individual. It's just a question of who and whose interest, but that's another story. But if you look in Britain, if you imagine it, you've now got a problem, because there's no welfare state. There's no state providing for people. You just go out and rely on benefactors, generous people who might choose to look after you. And if you read Charles Dickens, you'll find out, rich guys who'll be nice and take a little boy off the street and bring them up as their, long lost son. We've all read these books. But that didn't happen very much, because rich guys aren't really interested in poor guys. They hang around with other rich guys. Of course they do. So that's what they do. Now, the problem with this is people are dying in the streets. Now, this is bad for people's sensibilities. You don't want to see kids, women, dying in the streets. So what you do, you invent or develop a thing called a workhouse. So somebody works out what's the worst possible conditions where you could live in. And whenever people go into these workhouses, they are a victim of market forces.
Well,
that's what happens when...
Well, Dr. Armstrong, I just want to make sure that we understand each other here, that I want to focus as much as possible, if we can, on the situations that are currently going on in the West, just because a lot of things you bring up, they are important, but these are things that Friedrich Engels was pointing out way back then, which I think was responsible for having so many people back then being far more ardently communist, if we're talking about the turn of the century, as opposed to now. It didn't come from nowhere. It came from exactly exactly what you're talking about, but lo and behold, less and less people started becoming communists and socialists, and it may have probably been because they were not seeing those same horrible situations that people were in. Now, that's not to say that these social programs did not contribute in a certain way. I guess the question is, in today's developed world, in today's first world that we're living in right now, what would be a better way for a lot of these things to be implemented, whether it is through the government or whether it is through independent means, now that we are not at the level that Friedrich Engels was complaining about anymore. So I want to make sure we focus on today.
Okay, moving to today, what these guys are saying, let's be honest, let's be brutally honest. They want the same system, no state, no welfare state, no safety net. They rely on voluntary individuals. That's what Keith said. You don't want the state. State's the wrong engine. And he nodded, he knows I'm right. He's got a faith that the poor, the sick, the old will be looked after by voluntary people. Now, I'm saying, you know, in my age, and I've lived in the US, I've lived in European countries, it's a nice idea. It just doesn't work. Now, the problem for libertarians, and I would count myself as a socialist libertarian. I don't believe in autocracy. You know, I don't believe in central planning. You know, if you said how many British industries should be run by the state, I would probably say railways and the energy companies, and that's about your lot. I believe that individuals should be able to use their initiative, as I said, to create wealth. Fine, provided they look after workers, without repeating myself. But the idea that you can run a society based on individual choice and everything will come out great and poverty will go down if you've got a small sector. If you rank the countries of the world now, if you look at the quality of life, the levels of poverty, and you put down if you rank inequality on a Gini coefficient against quality of life, it's a very close match between those countries with the least inequality and the highest living standards. There's one or two exceptions, like the United States, maybe one or two other countries, but most of the best countries to live in, where you get the lowest poverty rates, are ones which are so-called Nordic models or mixed economies. They have a strong bedrock welfare state where the state provides things which the private sector is unable to provide efficiently. It cares for the poor. And I have a rule: you judge a society by how well it cares for the poor, not how much opportunity it gives to the rich. Great opportunities for the rich, but you look after the poor first. Now, libertarianism on the right, and I'm on the left, does not provide an adequate safety. If you've got a woman who's poor, 3 children to look after, oh, well, there's no welfare state, but if you write enough letters to Jeff Bezos, he might give you some dollars. I mean, it's a joke, you know? We have to move away from that. Now, I don't agree with massive state control of things and the state being captured by oligopoly businesses. And what is interesting, I met an Austrian school economist who was absolutely the opposite of me politically and economically. And we both agreed that the state should not have, or the central bank, bailed out all those banks.
I want to make sure. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I said, what I would have done is, I would have said, I would have given all the people who had deposits there, I would have kept their money. It's not their fault. They would have gone into a state shell. And all the guys that ran the banks, businessmen, who done all that dodgy dealing, should have all gone bust. Whereas his view was, yeah, they should have gone bust. You know, the central bank's just an agent of big business. Probably what Keith and Clint would get rid of the central. He didn't want a central bank. He's a free bank.
The correct point of view.
Yeah,
so,
that's what he said. I like this guy. We had fish and
Good for him.
chips together. But he would have got rid of the depositors' money as well, because it's their own fault for choosing the wrong bank. Now, so we in some ways, I kind of get this idea of not trusting the state. But what happens with libertarians, they go too far. And I'll give you one last little point. If you had a motorbike, right, and it didn't work very well, you go to a mechanic, he doesn't fix it very well. Do you never go to another mechanic i.e., you don't want a state because they make things worse? Or do you think, whoa, it's difficult being a site. We need a better government. We need a government that's more open and a government which will do things for the poor. And that's why, I mean, it's not about, I'm not saying a good government and a big state is enough. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Be quiet.
Before Keith responds, I just have a quick question to ask to Dr. Armstrong. Why is it that, at least from what I've noticed, a lot of MMT people are also socialist? Why it is that goes together? And then I would love Keith's response to what you were talking about.
No, I gotta get a response in too.
Yeah.
All right. Yes.
My feeling is that, and this sounds a little bit wishy-washy, all right? And forgive me. When I teach economics, right, which I've done for 40-odd years, I'll always say I want to teach it. Why do I teach it? Why is it important? Because I want to make the world a better place. Now, the way I see of doing that is balancing state intervention on the one hand with private individual freedoms on the other. So if you've got a good idea and you want to run your own business and be productive, and all these things I've said. So it's a balance. Now, most MMTers want to make the world a better place. They want to make poverty reduce. And they see, although MMT isn't a policy prescription, you can't implement it. What MMTers are saying is, once you understand the system, you can actually bring in policies to reduce inequality, to protect the environment, to help our children, if you see what I mean. Now, in the sense, and that's why they're mainly socialists. Now, Keith actually made the point, I think Clint as well, you can't be an MMT and be a libertarian. Well, I think Warren, who's the founder, he spoke to the Tea Party because he reckons that you could be if you just said, right, okay, we'll have a very small state, very small taxes. But that's why it's a motivational thing. I mean, it sounds a little bit dreamy-eyed, but you know, maybe Clint and Keith want a better life for people, but we think the state is a crucial, not the only role. All right. I mean, the difference between Keith and Clint is they think the government is a negative and private individuals are the only positive. I think it's a combination of the two. So you got to draw those things together, and that's why MMTs, I think, are predominantly left.
I know the gears are.
And let me just clarify,
okay,
because it's not that. It's not that I just pick this group called government and then pick on the kind, virtuous politicians of the world. My point is there are two ways to achieve your ends in life, the voluntary and the violent. So whether someone is a non-state actor who's engaging in slavery or human trafficking or theft or battery or assault, those are all immoral. And I just extend that principle to the state. So it's not like I just randomly pick a group. We say that people should achieve their ends voluntarily instead of violently. And what makes the state a unique institution with all the fairy tales surrounding it is they claim the right to do something that no one else has the right to do. And that's to go up to people who they haven't contracted with and say, pay this, perform this regulatory action, or we'll put you in a cage and shoot you if you resist. I mean, talk about exploitation of the worker. They have the right to own the workers' bodies, and the workers don't have the right to disassociate. So I could take the same position with, well, Keith and Clint, well, they just have a lot of faith in the market, but history has shown that out. And, bad things have happened historically. So let me take that point and let's see if we could take that criticism and apply it to the state. Well, Dr. Armstrong has good faith in government, and it sounds good, but you have people like Pol Pot who murder a third of Cambodians. You know, it sounds good, but then you have people like Lord Asquith in the First World War giving Belgium a war guarantee, which leads to a world war and kills millions of men, millions of civilians, and it enslaves millions of people through conscription. I mean, government, it sounds good, but then you get guys like Adolf Hitler. I mean, government sounds good, but then you get guys like Chairman Mao. Government sounds good, but then you get people like Joseph Stalin and Idi Amin. So in the same way that you can say, well, we have faith in the voluntary sector, not necessarily. All we're saying is when we're dealing with people, these people can either have the right to associate with us voluntarily or the right to rule us and the right to say they have the ability to do things that no one else does. So in the case of the car mechanic, yes, bad car mechanics will exist under any society. So the question is, should you be allowed to disassociate with a bad car mechanic? The state says, no. If they do a bad job, they should get more money. The libertarian says bad car mechanics will exist. The best way to hedge our bets against the bad mechanics and bad teachers, which I guess could theoretically exist, we need to be able to disassociate with the bad actors. Only the libertarian does that. When it comes to, well, they'll be paying us pennies on the dollar, he has to account for why the fact that about 1% of workers in America get paid the federal minimum wage. Competition and voluntary interaction have done more for the poor than psychopathic politicians writing words on paper ever will. He also continues to use the word individual, attempting to get you in the state of Robinson Crusoe alone on the island, just nugging coconuts together. Everything you do, let's say you're playing solitaire all by yourself. Well, you didn't invent the game solitaire. You didn't invent the computer you're playing on. You didn't invent the deck of cards. You didn't invent the electricity that you're currently using or the house you're in. You exist because people are constantly cooperating. Nothing you do is individually done. So the question is, everything we do is interconnected and cooperative. The question is, this is what differentiates our ideology, whether that cooperation should be done voluntarily and giving people, the workers of the world, have the ability to disassociate with bad actors, or they don't. Therefore, the libertarian position is not only economically superior, but morally superior. Clint, where have I gone wrong?
I don't think you've gone wrong anywhere. I just wanted to add that the reason I believe you can't have MMT with a libertarian society is because the state will essentially metastasize to whatever financial constraints that it has put upon it, and under MMT, self-reportedly, you guys claim at least that there would be no financial reins put on. So that's my belief, is that why you would not have a minarchist state, even though I lean ANCAP. You wouldn't. I mean, the idea that you would just have a military and a court system it's just you might briefly, but it would rapidly grow. I also wanted to make one other point about the guaranteed work minimum wage of $12. This concept that a business hiring for someone for less than that should not be in business. It does away with the entire concept of startups and people working apprenticeships to try and learn trades, especially if you don't have any skills. And the concept, the idea that having these make work programs where everyone is assured this government position at $12 an hour, well, you have no incentive to actually, one, you would have to accept everybody, which means that you're going to have workers that are terrible. I mean, you're going to have people that are using drugs on the job and things like that, because you can't fire them because they have to be assured this job, right? So why would these particular people, I don't see how they would ever get off of that make work program. It would just be like, well, they're not actually gaining any skills that will be able to be utilized in a free market by higher wage paying employers. So I think on both fronts, that's just catastrophically wrong and bad, and would create an economy that is relatively stagnant. And last note I wanted to make is that everything that you lament when it comes to income inequality is a product of central banking. I just have to double down on that point. It's the reason that we have such incredible income inequality in America is because of these goddamn bailouts that happened in 2008. You have all these people that are making enormous sums of money, managing their capital in a terribly perilous fashion, and they aren't forced to pay the price because they are politically connected. And we all know that that's how this game works now. So you have money managers that are propagating the same corrupt, broken misallocation of capital, leading right up into today, where we had the greatest economic everything bubble in probably the history of the world. And I think that we're going to pay tremendous price once again, because these businesses believe that they will be bailed out, and they're probably right. And to Phil's advantage here, unfortunately, most of the American people and the global population believe that this is a product of capitalism, whereas Keith and I'm sure would argue that it is not capitalism, that this is in fact central banking run amok. And the reason that we oppose MMT so strongly is because it's now making the the people of the world unite to demand a more powerful state. Our argument would be that it's the powerful state and the central banking is the reason that we're in such dire straits to begin with.
Oh, by the way, before we go on further, one of my favorite comments of all time today is from Kami John, who says, Stalin eradicated poverty. So there we go. And some people too. So a couple of things also before Dr. Armstrong responds. I would love for Dr. Armstrong to talk about the prevention of government metastasization that you were talking about, as well as preventing bad workers from being in this Make Work program. But the other two instances that I want to pay attention to here regarding the NHS, which I find to be pretty disturbing, are those two kids, Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard, if you guys remember what happened there, where there was an opportunity to seek outside intervention, but the NHS was against this, if I remember this correctly. So that is another situation where governments are able to go in between parents and what they are able to do with their kids as far as seeking some, solution to the problem that they're in. And that to me is a very disturbing thing. But anyway, I would love Dr. Armstrong's response either to the metastasization of government that Clint talked about, or the situation with the drug-addicted workers. So either one of those, both, whichever order you want, go for it, my friend.
Okay, thanks, Lev. The metastasization is the Hayek talked about that. It's the thin end of the wedge. Now, the famous Austrian school, Keith and Home. I've got one or two. He's quite an interesting guy, Hayek, by the way. I don't agree with everything he said, but he's quite interesting. He did say that Keynes was the one great man he ever knew, and that's quite a nice thing to say. But what I would say, the only thing he got wrong. Well, Keynes gave him a job and rescued him. I mean,
I'm just
Keynes
kidding.
is the sort of guy, he rescued all his opponents. So. The first thing there is, it's this sense of if you once allow a bit of government, it's going to kind of take over and do everything. Now, to be honest, going back to Britain, when we had the health service and, we nationalised the railways in the 40s, that's what a lot of people said. They said, once you start a bit, it'll take over the whole economy and we will end up like the Soviet Union, but it didn't happen. So my argument is in practice, it doesn't happen. Like in, the Nordic countries, I'm not saying they're perfect. They have a big state sector, but they also have a very prosperous and productive private sector, like in Japan, privately owned railways. Obviously there are certain state ways to stop it going bust. We won't go into that. So I don't agree that it'll just take over. But I accept the fact that if you see the government as sort of this sense of it's a sinister force, and I get that, and you want to keep it at arm's length, the risk of that happening, I accept what you're saying. With a job guarantee, people who are on drugs or people who don't do what they should be doing would get the sack because they're not ready, willing, and able to work. So if, for example, you were ready, willing, and able to work, say you lost your job as a bricklayer, and there wasn't any job as a bricklayer, you would go to the job guarantee and you get a job as a bricklayer, maybe doing some social housing projects. You'd only be earning $12 an hour. It's not as much as you would have done in a proper job, obviously, but it's better than nothing. Keep your skills. If you were arriving drunk every day, you get the sack. Then you would drop down to a lower level, which would be your income welfare payments, which are there to protect your wife and everybody else in your family. Then you'd have retrain, you go back and have another go. And if you fail, you get the sack, like in anything. Somebody like loads of jobs. So, it's a proper job and you get the sack, if you do it wrong. Not saying you can never go back. So it's no different to that. The other factor is that Keith says, and it's very interesting, is he criticizes governments, and he's right to do so because most governments in the world, and I live in England, just think about that. You think about our prime minister, I'm still arguing for the state. Whoa, some of you guys are Trump. I mean, the guy who's telling people to inject themselves with, disinfectant and it'll kill COVID. He's in charge of the country. You know what I mean? So I'm not saying these guys.
Wait, to be fair about that, and I am not a fan of the guy, but to be fair about that was not disinfectant. That was a special thing that was used for real people, if I remember it correctly. I just want to make sure for the record.
He had just
Right.
been told.
Yeah,
he
yeah.
had just been told about
Okay.
some new scientific
All right.
breakthrough.
It was a
Yeah,
disinfectant light that was eventually used to kill COVID. So I'm going to give you a better one. Donald Trump used weapons in Yemen. Let's just take one country that murdered
Yes,
tons
yeah.
of civilians
Yeah,
and
yeah.
murdered civilians in
Yeah.
Afghanistan. Now, at least he didn't offer them a job and exploit them, but he used the
Yeah, yeah.
democratic state to send them to heaven for free.
Yeah, the problem with your idea is, and I'm trying to get my head round it, you know, but the problem with it is, in many ways, is right. I can't envisage a society. I mean, it's almost like a utopia. You've got this idea where people are free to do anything they want according to their own conscience, all right, subject to maybe laws, except one thing. They can't organize themselves into a government, and they can't provision themselves as a government, so they can do everything they like. Now, it sounds like a novel, a utopian novel, but I cannot conceive of any society that actually exists in your world where private individuals just do lovely things all the time. They don't allow poverty. They look after each other in this almost warm and cozy way with each other. It's kind of a nice idea, but living in Britain, like for 200 years, we realize it just doesn't work. And when you look back into history, right, this idea of a free market, and this is part of the MMT thing, which will please Lev, because he's been all about politics. People talk about free markets like many, many years ago. They don't say when, right? Because that would be facts, and we don't want to bring facts into it. Many, many years ago, people were wandering around in villages swapping sandals for fish. And some guy thought of an idea. Let's use money. And what's that? One guy said, let's use gold. And they magically found it, these private individuals. So they swap bartering things, and they use gold instead. And then what happened is the central bank came along and pirated all the gold. And people naturally create markets, and then the government comes along and takes them over. Now, the problem with that is it sounds a lovely story, but even the writers admit it's made up. They call it conjectural. The reason being there is zero, and I mean zero. Let's say that again, zero evidence of a society ever existing based on barter. No anthropology ever found it. Never. There is no evidence, and I mean, again, zero, of money ever coming out of barter. All money, and I'm not talking about whether it's good or bad. Money is always, with a capital A, always, and in every case, the creation of the state. The state creates money as a means to provision itself. Now, you don't want the state to provision itself. I get that. You've got this dream world of private individuals without a state. I get that. But you have to realize, in my opinion, not to be patronizing. A lot of the things you say are very entertaining. It's been great to speak. It just, I do find it interesting. And I don't want to be patronizing. It just can't exist. Because if you had a group of people in any sort of situation, the first thing they do is find a leader, and then they find a government. That's what people do. That's why you look at all the countries in the world, and the one thing they've all got, some of it's bad, some of it's very bad, like Britain. Some of it was very bad in America under Trump. I mean, not to be rude, I'm not a massive fan of Biden either, but you know, I don't want to be impolite. He's your leader. Fair enough.
He's not our leader. Don't worry.
Okay, I'm not going to offend anyone, but there you go. Now, the problem with it is, yes, you're right. And Keith gave me a long list, and I was very impressed. He rolled them off of all the bad leaders. Stalin, murdered about 20 million people. Hitler, I don't know how many he paid to. But it's hard to find a country that doesn't have a government. So what I'm saying is your world is a nice world. Maybe, not for me, but for some. But it doesn't exist. Free markets have always been constructed. And my last little point is just on the markets thing. Originally, the rulers always decided what could be sold, where it could be sold, and when it could be sold. That's why you have marketplaces and market days. They're not spontaneous. If you were a king, right, in England, say, which is the country I know best, you don't let people truck and barter with anything they want. You won't get any seigniorage out of that. So you say what people can sell, where they can sell it, and when they can sell it. Now, you guys don't like that, I know, but it's just the way things have always been. So what I would say is, I respect some of the things you say, and I know you're anti-war, like me. I'm a left libertarian, not a right libertarian. I believe the state has a role to play, much bigger role than you guys. But you're living in a world that, in my opinion, simply can't exist. Your best bet, in my opinion, not to be patronizing, embrace MMT. You've got to have a central bank, because if you don't have one, someone will become a de facto central bank. In the 19th century, when there aren't any central banks, the biggest bank becomes the central bank. And when it goes bust, you get all the massive recessions in the US in the 19th century. That's my opinion. So embrace the central bank. Keep that idea of the American dream, and just get yourself a much better government. You had a guy who was okay, a guy called Sanders, never his favorite. He would have been all right. And if we'd had him and Jeremy, I'm not saying they're perfect, but we've been a whole lot better than Biden and Big Boris. All right? Because your world doesn't exist. It can't exist. That's what I'm saying.
Well, wait. I gotta respond here. I gotta respond here, fellas. And I know the gears are turning. You guys can't wait to respond to Dr. Armstrong, and I appreciate that. I gotta say something just because I think it may be a little bit different than what you guys are going to say. So I agree with Keith when he was talking about the iron law of oligarchy, which is states that all forms of organization, regardless of how democratic they may be at the start, will eventually and inevitably develop oligarchic tendencies, thus making true democracy practically and theoretically impossible, especially in large groups and complex organizations. Adding to that, I think that there is something to be said for hierarchy 100%. Even in small places like a town hall, you would have somebody that would be calling the shots. Hierarchy naturally ends up being organized. And I think the reason...
I gotta run, but I just...
Oh, no.
Yeah.
All right,
I just
then you go for it, and then I'm going to go for it.
Yeah, okay. Let me just make one final note.
Yes.
I'm not anti-hierarchy at all. I just believe that it should be merit-based as opposed to force and government-based. So I don't have a problem with the leader naturally arising and people deciding to follow a leader. That's totally fine, and there's nothing unlibertarian about that. In fact, that's perfectly natural, and it would be completely counter to human nature and behavior to believe that that wouldn't occur. So I don't think that Keith or I would ever argue to the contrary. So that is one point, and then secondarily, I am blanking on my second point. So it doesn't matter. I'm going to get out of here. Go ahead and follow me at Liberty Lockpod on Twitter. Just broke 42,000, and I really appreciate everybody's support. Thank you so much for your time. Dr. Phil, I'm going to call you that because it's funny. Keith Knight and Lev, thank you so much, guys, for having me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. All right, I'm going to switch the screens right now.
Subscribe to Liberty Lockdown. I'm out.
Hell yeah, subscribe to Liberty Lockdown. All right, so hold on, let me fix the screens over here for a second. Let's see, 2 people, 3 people. Hold on one sec. Oh, that's because I have this annoying screen here. Let me get rid of that, and we are good. Okay, we are back to where we were before. Okay, so my point about hierarchy, which Keith may disagree with me about, and maybe Dr. Armstrong also will disagree with me about, happens to concern England. In England, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was, from what I understand, a lot of discontentment with the way things were working in the industrial sector. A lot of people were calling for straight-up, outright communism. I think what happened, and Dr. Armstrong, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the elites, who I think are important, it is important to have elites in a hierarchy, the elites were not dumb. they knew that there had to be some kind of a social safety net for people, and by implementing one, they would avoid going fully into communism. And I think that there has been a lot of situations where these politicians would come in, they would say, oh, I'm for the people, but these weren't true believers like Corbyn. These were people who knew exactly what they were doing so as to trick a lot of very gullible and romantic young people into voting for them while still keeping the system that they have. It's not a great system, but in that quote you were talking about democracy, not being the best, but the best that we have, what Winston Churchill was talking about. I would equate this not with democracy, but with this strange little system that we currently have where there is corruption in it, and it has to be fought, but at the same time, we do not have true believers at the helm. When we have true believers at the helm, like a Trotsky or a Lenin or a Corbyn, then we would have hell to pay, because these people cannot be bought. And that, to me, my friend, is one of the scariest things in the world. When you have somebody who cannot be bought because they are a true believer and they are going to go for with what they want to do. I just wanted to throw that out because I don't think that would have been brought up otherwise. But yeah, that's what I have to say there. Dr. Armstrong, any comments on that? And then I would love to go to Phil.
Yeah, I'll you can call me Phil. I mean,
go to Keith.
Yeah. I'll let Keith come in a minute because I know I've been doing a lot of talking. Forgive me. No, I mean, I think the idea of comparing Corbyn with Trotsky and people like that it's very popular in the British right-wing press. These guys were kind of part of a very autocratic state, like rule from the top. Corbyn is actually a libertarian. Is a libertarian socialist. Now, what he did was, when he took over the Labour Party, he increased democracy. So he asked his members to tell him what questions to ask in Parliament. He tried to devolve power down to the bottom. Now, he was laughed at by the press, and what happened with Corbyn is very, very interesting. I don't want to talk too much about British politics. When he arrived in 2017, he was regarded as a bit of a joke. He was scruffy. He rode a bike. He wasn't a statesman. He grew marrows. And he's very interested on the patterns drawn on manhole covers, right? So he's an odd bod. And in Britain, and he's very well known for fighting like causes that they're never going to win. Like he flew to Chechnya to support the Chechens when they were fighting Putin, when Putin was flavor of the month with Bush and Blair. Yeah. He would do things like that. And the joke was, they actually said in Parliament, get a suit, smarten yourself up, you're no good. And he was regarded as a joke figure. But in 2017, he did really well. And that frightened the British establishment out of their skins. He is a guy who's an ordinary, he's got nothing whatsoever to do with the Soviet Union. As I said, he'd been criticizing the Soviet Union more than any other British. Boris is taking a lot of money off the Russians. That's another question. The Russian money wasn't going to Jeremy. Now, what the right wing love to do is anyone on the left they don't like, they compare to the Soviet Union. Now, the equivalent would be, which would horrify someone like Keith, because he's on the right, he's a right libertarian. If we compared him to sort of a fascist, a guy who's on the right but an autocrat, he'd be horrified by that. Now, if I've got four squares on the screen, you've got the right, you've got the left, you'll notice you've got autocrats and libertarians. Now, I'm a left libertarian, like Jeremy. He's not a centralizer. He's not an autocrat. So that's Jeremy, all right? And you're right, he couldn't be bought. But the thing about it is the establishment couldn't absorb him like Blair. Blair was absorbed. Now, Blair loved America. He loved that presidential stuff, walking down with the lecterns with Bush, standing shoulder to shoulder. And he loved all that. He's very popular, apparently, in, certain strands of the US, So that would be my kind of response to the politics thing. And I have some sympathy with what sometimes libertarians say, and I'll temper that, about this idea of this oligarchy and the state being captured by big business. I agree with that. We need checks and balances. But the thing about MMT is, coming back to that, once we know that the government does spend by data entry, it is never limited by taxes. The whole idea is nonsense. All right, spends by data entry. Taxes are there to maintain the value of the currency. You need more accountability. So I think government should be very accountable for what they're spending money on, because Keith is right. If the government in the UK employed more nurses and more doctors and more people to build roads and law courts, those real resources would not be available for the private sector. Now, I'm all for it. I think the government should say that and say, look, if we have more nurses, you won't have enough people to be bank managers. What do you want? But don't say we're running out of money. Don't say we can't afford to employ more nurses. You can. It's a question of, do you want a larger health service with a bigger amount of state workers in it? Now, Keith would obviously say, no, he doesn't want that. But I do. But you know what I mean? So that I agree with corruption in government. I agree there are a lot of bad governments. I just say it's not a reason to get rid of them. We want better ones. That's what I'm saying. And if we'd have had Jeremy, whoa, we would have a better one. And he has nothing whatsoever to do with the Soviet Union. He has been an opponent of Putin, and I'm put that on the record now. You can check it. When Blair was shaking Putin's hand outside it in 2001, and when Bush was saying he's a man we can work with, Jeremy was opposing him. You know, let's get
where could I look this up when you're talking about Jeremy Corbyn opposing Putin? And I want to get to Keith right after, but if I were to look this up,
I couldn't tell you for sure. Just put it into Google, have a look. You know, have a look what he said about Russian money coming into Britain, about the Tory party getting donations from Russia, all this sort of stuff. And now they're calling Putin's puppet, all the rest of it. It's just the right-wing press. They do that all the time.
Well, the strange thing... Okay, go on, yes. I just want to say that the Russian government has been supporting both the far left and the far right for a long time. And I don't really see that changing anytime soon. I will look this up with what you're saying about him being against it. But anyway, Keith, go on.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn also supported Hugo Chavez in Venezuela as he created hyperinflation and gave the richest oil country in South America more poverty than they otherwise would have had. So you don't have to wonder, well, if only we would have had Corbyn. You had Corbyn in Venezuela, and that's why you never hear about it anymore. As far as, is this realistic? Well, all you have to do is take the principle you have for all other organizations in society and apply it to this group called government. So it's not that murder should never exist, even though we'd like murder to never exist. The question is, are we going to recognize murder, rape, theft, kidnapping as legitimate or illegitimate? In no society will those things ever go away. The question is, will the people in your society have a default position against those things? So yes, it is possible not to ever do away with aggression on a planet with 7 billion human beings constantly achieving their own ends, sometimes at the expense of others. What makes it realistic is people's ability to extend what they already do, which is make sure that someone like Lev does not have the right to rule me. If he wants to offer me something, or if he wants to ask for charity, he can absolutely do it. So yes, it is realistic when it comes to the reality of whether or not there are real world examples of more free markets increasing the well-being of the worst among us. Well, two of the closest controlled experiments you can have. It's not really fair to compare Finland to America, so different and everything. What you can do is compare Finns who originate from Finland, who have immigrated to America, and just as when you find Swedes who have immigrated to America, their incomes are higher than they previously were in Finland and Sweden. That's a little closer than just comparing two completely different countries. Another controlled experiment would be if we took the Korean Peninsula and made the North communist and we made the South much more free market than the communist, and of course, capitalism wins that victory. We could take Germany and slice it down the middle and have the East go communist. So Stalin runs East Germany to Vladivostok, and we saw much more poverty in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe, rather, than we did in the West. Of course, all the crimes in the West, even if you take those as totally unjustifiable, what makes them bad is they initiated violence against peaceful people. That is what makes those things so terrible. When it comes to China, much wealthier today as a causal result of increasing the amount of private property and voluntary exchanges after the 1970, after Mao's dead, and they embraced more free markets at the end of 1979. In the case of India, since 1991, they've seen a drastic increase in wealth as a causal result of embracing free trade. When it comes to places like Africa, you have countries like Botswana and Zimbabwe very close together, much similar populations. Botswana having much more private property, free markets, voluntary contracts, and exchanges, being wealthier than Zimbabwe. After the British started calling back their colonies in the 60s, the presidents of Ghana and the Ivory Coast had a bet as to whose economy would increase at a faster rate. The president of Ghana famously said, well, we're taking control of this economy. We're not going to, let it fall away like you idiot free market advocates. And of course, the Ivory Coast smashed Ghana in every metric from child mortality to increase in the individual standard of living. So in the real world, yes, there are examples of capitalism doing more for the poor than the state. Again, Mr. Armstrong is not addressing. It's not that I don't want to help the poor.
Dr.
It's not
Armstrong.
that I don't want charities. It's whether or not charities have the right to force people to fund them. It's not that I don't like, say, the Catholic Church or the Boy Scouts or anyone else. I like some and don't like others, and just want everyone to have the ability to disassociate with organizations they don't like. So if you support the workers, you cannot both support the workers and advocate a state that violently stops them with the threat of imprisoning them if they follow their conscience by not chipping in for something, maybe chipping in later, maybe investing that money. They might think we'll do more for the poor than giving it to charity. I'm much more thankful that investments in businesses were made in, say, 1860, as opposed to all the money of the evil bourgeoisie confiscated by the state and then distributed to all the poor. That would not have given Cornelius Vanderbilt the ability to make railroads and steamships accessible to the average person. It would not have given Andrew Carnegie the ability to drastically decrease the price of steel. It wouldn't have given Rockefeller the ability to drastically decrease the price of oil and make it available to the masses. It would not have given Henry Ford the ability to make the automobile, to not to invent it, but to make it available to the average person as it is now, except for the fact that inflation through the central bank is making it harder for us to access all of these terrific things. So the bottom line is, coming to the heart of this, is I want to start working for Lev Polyakov. Now, Lev does not have a lot of money. He might have to sell the books to hire me. So in the meantime, I'm going to ask to intern for him because I like him so much. And I'm going to accept $0.00 an hour because I want to gain on the job experience, and I have such a crush on Lev. Anything to get his attention, I'm willing to do it. Does the state or any other third party have the right to coercively stop me and Lev from engaging in this voluntary capitalist interaction between consenting adults?
There's a lot there. First of all, Venezuela is an old classic. Now, before I go into this caricature, which Keith loves to do, he's a nice guy, but he does it all the time. He keeps talking about, comparing North to South Korea or East to West Germany. Now, the implication is I like, or have some sort of intimated that I like autocratic states. But you'll notice, you go back to the interview, I've never said I agree with autocracy of any sort. I'm a libertarian socialist. I repeat, don't agree with central planning. So who would I like to live in, West Germany or East Germany? West Germany ain't perfect, but I don't agree with the Soviet Union. I've never said that. And if you put into Google, I tried it, Lev, you put in Jeremy Corbyn criticizes Putin, you get a lot of stuff he was saying for 20 odd years. I am not in any way saying that autocratic states on the right or on the left are ones I support. I support freedom of the individual, all right, within rules set by democracy. The difference between Keith and me, and it's a big difference, let's not minimize that, is I'm saying that we have a right and we have a responsibility. And those responsibilities like to say to pay our time, doesn't it? Taxes fund things. A good example is, and there's a guy called Tony, he's a Christian socialist like me, and he talks about self-made men being a myth. Take Alan Sugar, a favourite in Britain, millionaire, East End barra boy, if that means anything to you. He's come from a poor background, he's worked hard, he's made a lot of money. Well done, Alan. I've done it myself. So you say to Alan, right, when you workers get ill, who makes them well again? The health service do that. Do you pay for that? Like, is it you personally? Oh, no, it's free. Who built the roads and the airports to get your staff to work? Did you pay for those? Oh, I didn't do that either. When people do things wrong and you have to sue them, did you personally design the law system? Oh, no, I didn't do that either. That's the state. I said, well, can all you workers read and write, Alan? Oh, yeah. Did you personally train them from age of 5? Oh, I didn't do that either. And then he said, well, you're a self-made man. If you put these guys in, if you put Carnegie in the middle of the Sahara Desert in 1850, he would died of starvation and thirst. We are all part of a community. Now, that's why the state is vital. The state spends on things we need, and if we don't like what they spend on, we boot them out. Now, I'm with Keith. We need to know what they're doing. We need to break down, and we need to pursue relentlessly the capture of government by corporate interests. But that doesn't mean we get rid of government. And this idea of comparing what I'm saying, a Corbyn supporting leftist with autocratic, is just not correct. And if I go to Venezuela, I'm not a big fan of Chavez. All right, but let's get the facts right before we do anything else. Before Chavez took over, Venezuela was an extremely poor country. And you can check the GDP data. Very poor. Much poorer than Colombia, right? You have a look at the data when you come offline. Under Chavez's rule, it became one of the richest countries in Venezuela. He cut poverty massively. Now, I'm saying he's a great guy, he isn't. Now, how did he do that? Well, he was very fortunate. And you guys will know this. The price of oil went up. So he now, in simple terms, I mean, not into too much complexity, he can now buy a lot of stuff with the dollars he's earned from his oil sales. That means he can keep on paying his workers very generously and giving them welfare programs because there's plenty to buy. Why is there plenty to buy? Because he's earning dollars to buy them with. And not everyone's happy, but most people are happy. He had a lot of opposition from right-wing businesses, etc. And the Americans didn't like him because he was showing that, whoa, a socialist could do well. And more than that, he was supporting Cuba. And boy, the Americans didn't like that. Now, unfortunately for Venezuela, the oil price crashed. Chavez died. You'll know the rest. In comes Maduro. Now, Maduro is now in big trouble because the oil price has crashed. And you can look, the dollar earnings are really falling. There was a point, I think, in COVID when the oil price was negative. So I don't want to go into too much detail.
No, but while that was going on, though.
Yeah, but I'm finished.
All right.
Trump put sanctions on Venezuela. So Venezuela can't sell oil. All right. It's got almost no resources in its country. Now, at that point, you might argue, in an ideal world, what a sensible government would do. We've got nothing to buy, so we need to spend a lot less. But they kept on spending when there was nothing to buy. Now, you know the result of that was hyperinflation, as Keith said, and they're all leaving the border to go over Colombia. But the root cause of that was poor organization, yes, and a thing called the Dutch disease. Now, the Dutch disease is where you only produce one product and you concentrate on that. Now, Venezuela just concentrated on producing oil and it couldn't produce much else. Now it's in big trouble. So the root cause of it is complicated. It's a combination of Dutch disease, poor government. But the front up cause is the oil price crash and the US sanctions. You'll notice now, strangely enough, with the war in Ukraine, the Americans are a bit more friendly with Venezuela now. And you have a look, you'll see the oil revenues are going up, and they'll probably start to relax sanctions a bit. You might even see your pal Biden say, well, we like this guy a bit more, this Maduro. Maybe he isn't so bad. So it's a bit more complicated than that. And the other point I'll mention, if you forgive me, Keith mentioned about the central bank causing inflation. Right, now, let's get this absolutely straight. The central bank has almost nothing to do with inflation. The best example I can give you is, imagine Keith was my dad. He's a lot younger than me. But let's assume this is the way around. So Keith's driving along. All right, he's driving. And I've got a little plastic, little thing like that next to him. I think I'm driving the car, but Keith's driving the car. Now, as Keith, my dad, he's going like that. I do the same. And I still think I'm driving the car. Then suddenly there's emergency stop. A dog runs out. And that's when I find I'm not driving the car. Now, that's what central banks think, that they're controlling inflation. They're playing now with interest rates. But most of the time, nothing much happens, like the kid. But sometimes there's a shock. Now, we've now got a shock. And the shock is obviously, everybody knows it's a pandemic. There's a shortage of materials. There's a war in Ukraine. Oil prices are going up. Prices are an administered variable. People say what the price is. It's only to do with the central bank. The price goes up. Now, the central bank are struggling. They think, what we're going to do about prices? Now, you've got two choices if you're the Fed. You say, we don't know anything about it, and we can't solve it. Now, would you agree, Keith would agree with this, that'd be quite good fun. They'd have to close them down, which Keith would probably think result. That's one thing, we can't do anything about it. The other thing is, we're not really sure, we better put interest rates up. The only problem with that is US debt to GDP ratios are massive. Couldn't tell you what they are. Big, very big. So if they put the interest rate at 1%, that's 1% more free income to bondholders. So unfortunately, when the central bank puts the interest rate up, it just pumps loads of free money in. So it's expansionary. So what will happen is they'll put the interest rate up. If anything happens to inflation, it'll drive it up. So then, we haven't done enough. So they'll put the interest rate up a bit more and a bit more. And if they kept on doing it, they crash the economy. So the only way to deal with inflation, obviously, is to deal with the supply side. And that takes a long time. You need short supply chains. You need buffer stocks. Because we know if we're old enough what happened in the oil crisis when OPEC put the price of oil up 3 or 4 times. Inflation comes from costs. It's not about anything to do with this ridiculous idea of a bloke at the central bank printing money. You go, all right, lads, just press the button, we print more money. Nobody does that. The idea is ludicrous. Not to be too technical, forgive me, the money supply is endogenous. So if the price level goes up, and I say, Lev, you're running a business, all right? Price level's going up. All your materials, everything's going up 10%. You put your price up 10%. Keith works for you. You offer him, don't you, 10% more wages. In real terms, you're about the same. But that means there has to be more money to allow the system to operate at that price. If your banker doesn't allow you to expand your loan with him to do everything, the system crashes. So the central bank has to allow the money supply to expand to match the price, or the system crashes. That's how it works. It's passive.
I am curious about Keith's response to that specifically. Like, Keith, getting back to the MMT here, how would you have an alternate way for these problems not to occur and for the system not to crash?
If the supply of something is low, what you want to do is create the conditions where there is the biggest incentive for producers to increase the supply of goods and services, and you want there to be the fewest barriers in the way. As Dr. Armstrong clearly said, the U.S. implements sanctions on places like Cuba and Venezuela, and those places do much worse than they otherwise did. Now, when governments regulate countries that are far, it's called sanctions. When they regulate them domestically, it's just called government regulation. So there, he doesn't believe that it's just we, the people, making sure that things are going well. He sees they're clearly colonialist and psychopathic when one country does it to another. Well, what about when the politicians do it to their alleged constituents? If they really represented us, they would give us a choice to buy products or services from Colombia or Venezuela or Russia or Ukraine or Japan or anywhere else if they represented us. That's how we can tell whether or not they're forcibly stopping us from purchasing products or services. So how do you deal with low supply? The only thing you can do, of course, the result is if you want more, the conditions you would want to set in motion are ones that allow the most amount of people to increase the supply by making voluntary contracts and agreements with others to do so. When it comes to the baby formula shortage in America, there were surpluses in Europe, and there is actually a quota system on baby formula in America where you're not allowed to buy from European nations, one, because of the 17.5% tariff that was put on them. Two, there's a quota, so there's still a limit. Even if you want to buy it, the government is so here and so going to help you so much, they'll make sure your baby starves to death before they allow you to exchange money with a Frenchman for baby formula. So for the same reason, we shouldn't stop people from engaging in consensual sexual activities or for using drugs, maybe a left libertarian would appreciate, or reading books that are, quote, bad for your mind. It's still their life. When it comes to products and services, it's still their money. It's their time. It's it's their scarce ability to do what they want in the world. And to say that some people, the state, have the right to forcibly stop them from doing so makes everyone worse off. So that is my answer. We increase the supply by increasing the likelihood by creating a profit incentive, because usually you get a bunch of lazy commies just sitting around begging to steal things instead of actually producing anything. But if you have a profit incentive, they're much more likely to set down the Frederick Engels and pick up an actual hammer and sickle for the first time in their entire lives. And then they're more productive. This productivity increases the supply and makes people more prosperous than they otherwise would have been.
Well, I have a quick question for Keith. From what I understand, I'm looking at this a bit from the outside. I look forward to learning about all this, but it almost seems like you're fighting a war on two fronts here, where you have to solve a lot of these problems with the regulations. So you're saying you have to remove all these regulations and then it's going to function properly. Well, what if you don't get to do that? What if, for example, the system being as it is, that's not something you can address, and lo and behold, you have the potential for inflation if the government would produce more money, but let's say you don't want to do that. So what would you do in that case? If, for example, Dr. Armstrong's situation comes true and you are not going to rely on the Federal Reserve and you still have these regulations, if you just have to deal with that problem of not having to supply enough money, how do you get out of that situation if you're not going to get rid of regulation? Assuming you can't get rid of regulation.
Okay, so if you want to get something and then you can't get it, either you don't get it or it comes in through the black market. Sort of like drugs are illegal, you can't get them. No, it's just very costly and very risky. So a black market would develop because the price would then rise to such a point that it would become profitable for people to stop doing what they're doing and work in the black market. So it's like, well, what if you have cancer and then you can't live anymore? Okay, well, then you die. If all the options are off the table, well, then there's just nothing left. The socialists have created such a bad situation that we don't have any alternatives. So I feel like we're kind of exhausting the issue.
Yes.
Can we go into final closing?
Let's do it, yeah. So before going to the final statements, and once again, thank you so much, Dr. Armstrong, and thank you so much, Keith. I wanted to just say my particular criticism, not so much again with the MMT, which we can agree on that is just like the way that things are done. It could be done a different way, but more having to do with the tendencies of looking at we. Because Dr. Armstrong, you use the word we a lot. I see you as being a very smart, very well-to-do gentleman, just like I see Keith. When you're saying we, when the Russians were saying we, back to my ancestry here, when the Russians were saying we, it wasn't just Comrade Lenin and Comrade Trotsky. It was all the people who were serfs for hundreds of years, first under the Mongols, then under the aristocracy of Russia. And even though we had fantastic situations where Anton Chekhov, whose father was a serf, became an amazing writer, a lot of people were under this really bad mentality that I think was responsible to a certain extent with what we ended up seeing with the gulags, how people ended up treating each other. I believe culture does have an effect, which is why I believe that, for example, the culture in the Nordic countries, for example, where for a long time they were kind of acting like they didn't have serfs. They didn't have, from what I understand, they didn't even have peasantry in the same way that Europe did. So already the kind of system where things are very fair, they were able to be much more responsive to that system without crashing the whole thing down. With the Russian serfs, that is not the case. The reason why I say this is when throughout history a lot of intellectuals have used we, and they included the masses along with themselves. I don't know if you are taking as much into account the power of these masses to enact the tyranny of the majority, as I was talking about earlier, where we get demagogues who say, I am for the people and the people are for me, and all of a sudden we have a lot of these well-meaning intellectuals, sorry to use this, and I don't apply this to you specifically, but just to any person who is very romantic thinking about the we have a lot of these intellectuals being put up against the wall and shot by the thugs that end up taking power from the majority that want to see them in power. That is my criticism. It is not that I am against safety nets. It is that I am against this we tendency that ends up ushering in a lot of things that none of us actually want to live under. So that's my criticism. I just want to say it out there, and I appreciate you guys being here.
So we're going.
Can I just
we're going
step
into
in there?
closing?
Can I pop in there?
Are we going into closing?
Sorry.
Yes.
Can I just pop in and answer Lev? I only, because before I forget, then I'll come over to close. I'm very sorry, Keith. First of all, it's very kind of you, I think, Lev, to call me a well-to-do gentleman. Now, I am from Middlesbrough. You can have a look at that, and it has been voted the worst town in the country to live in. It's wrong. It's a great place. So I'm a working-class lad. My dad was a postman. My mum worked in service. So I am not in any way well-to-do. I mean, I've got a reasonable house because
You're polite.
I'm polite, and I got a free education, which kids can't get in England now. So in the sixth form, which is our high school, I got a grant, which is free cash to go to university. And I got a degree in economics. And later on, I got a couple more. The latest one I got was in my 60s, but that's another matter. Now, the thing is, I would not have gone to university under the current system where I had to get a loan. My dad would have said, you're joking, don't get a loan. So the 70s, there are problems with the 70s, technology was bad, black and white TV, if you look at it, the country was in black and white. So so when I say we, I kind of do mean we. Now, the thing about Russia, and I guess you've got Russian ancestry, mate. I'm
from there. I was born in the USSR.
Right. So more than Russian ancestry. Now, you would know more than this, but my study of Russia is that no matter who was in charge, whether it was a monarchy, whether it was Stalin's communism, or whether it's Putin, they're all autocrats. You had a monarchy who thought he could do anything he likes in the Tsar, and the result of that was starvation. You then had a guy who was a communist, in inverted commas, although given Marx hated the state, probably as much as Keith, and he regarded it should wither away, and he believed it to be a capitalist institution. So the idea that Marx would like a big state is a joke. I mean, if you read what Marx said, it was the collective capitalist. He didn't believe in it. So the idea that he would have liked the Soviet Union is just wrong. I'm not a Marxist scholar. My PhD supervisor is. And the third one is coming to Putin. Now, Putin, I would call, is on the right. He's no socialist. He has big oligarchs, rich guys. So you've got three different types of rulers, I would say. And you're the guy for Russia, you've got the autocratic Tsar, you've got the autocratic supposed communists, and you've got the autocratic Putin. Now, all of these guys have repressed freedom. So they're all autocrats. Now, the idea, Keith does it as a joke. He's a nice guy, talked about commies this and commies that. As if, like, I know in America, it's like a different, it's a bit of an insult, like, I'm not what you would call a commie. As I said, I'm not an autocrat. I don't figure. I'm on the left, but I believe in people being able to be free to do what they want within democratic rules. When I say we, I believe in a thing called communitarianism. I believe we are part of a community. No man is an island entire unto himself. Now, that is in tension with the individual. These two things are always in tension.
Yes.
Philosophically and ideologically. How much do we give ground for the good of the community? They're difficult philosophical questions, which we can't answer. Now, somebody like yourselves, maybe in Keith, we're at different ends. Now, that's the first point I would say. I don't agree with autocracy. And the other thing is the idea of incentivizing production that Keith talks about, profit motive. The profit motive is very important and it's a crucial area. But the point to make is it's not the only area. People are very different. For example, in the US, allegedly, you get paid for donating blood. So I've heard. In the UK, we don't. It's free. But we get more. It's just because people recognize it's a civic duty. When you walk past a guy in the street, right? He might be down on his luck. You give him a couple of pounds. Why do you do it? Where's the profit? There's no profit. You just do it. Not because it's some sort of utility tripe that they talk about in Maine. You do it because inside us. So everything we do in our lives is complicated. Now, I'm going to go back to Keith again and what he said about you, Lev. He said, should he have the right to volunteer to work for you, to help you? And maybe he might get paid by you later, maybe not. Of course, that's absolutely fine. All I'm saying is if you enter into a working contract, that he wants a working contract because he needs it. He might have 3 kids and home to feed. Then there's a minimum wage. So I, for example, done voluntary work when I retired. My son does voluntary work. My daughter's done voluntary work. These are all very important. So they're all freedoms. So what you have to do is not caricature the left in the Soviet Union in the way I maybe do the same thing to the right and caricature them a bit, as Trump supporters, when I know a lot of them aren't. People are complicated. So I'm a left libertarian. I have some things I agree with, Keith, and possibly yourself. I think the community and when we're born, we are born from birth into a community. And we act within the rules of that community for everyone's good. We all contribute. Now, the balance of that tension between individualism on the one hand and pursuing ourselves and the we word, which you pointed, these are always in tension. And that's why discussions like this, because I'm aware I don't necessarily agree with you guys, are very valuable. And I appreciate it. Now, obviously, I've spoken too long, and that's my final word. And I'll hand over to yourself, Lev and Keith, to tell me what you think.
Keith, go for it. Your final word.
When it comes to individual interest versus the collective well-being, I do not necessarily see a contradiction in either of these. One of the many ways you can harmonize these two interests is by making it so Lev can produce a show, and if others see it in their self-interest to watch the show, well, then they can do so. If someone wants to write one of the books that's sitting behind him in their own self-interest so they could, get the social status of being an author, so they could make money off the book, well, then Lev gets to purchase a book, and they're both have engaged in their individual self-interest while benefiting others. So if I can't get anything, any money generally outside of charity, if I can't get something unless I first produce something for someone else to buy, I am necessarily harmonizing individual self-interest and collective well-being. That is one of the many ways free markets can harmonize those two things that are not a contradiction at all. When it comes to being a communitarian, as I said with my solitaire example earlier, we're always cooperating. Anything you do by yourself when you're sleeping, you didn't make the bed, you didn't make the sheets, you're inside of a house that you didn't build. Nothing we do is by ourselves. So the question is, under any system where human beings live, They cannot do everything by themselves. So will this be done cooperatively and voluntarily, or will some people, the state, have the right to do things no other organization has the right to do and coercively stop them from engaging in voluntary exchanges? So, of course, no one is self-made. The non sequitur comes in when you say no one is self-made, therefore this group, only this group, has the right to coerce people into doing things. It's the equivalent of me saying, no one does anything by themselves. Don't you agree? Exactly. Therefore, anyone who doesn't obey Nigel Farage has to go to jail. And Nigel Farage is only going to do this in the well-being of the working class, because you have to have some rules, because if no one's in power, then it'll be like Britain in like the year 1400. And you don't want that. So therefore, Nigel Farage should have the right to rule other people. I notice that I'm allowed to work for Lev for $0, but I can't work for him for $1 or $2 or $3. I can't gain on-the-job experience. I can't get my foot in the door and gain the experience that will later allow me to demand a higher wage. Getting that first job and that on-the-job experience is so vital, because so many governments run the schools and the schools teach you nothing but how to pledge your allegiance to a flag. So when they conscript you, you'll feel much more like you're doing something for the greater good instead of being enslaved, which it actually is. So the main non sequitur is that just because we want something, we want to help people, it doesn't therefore follow, therefore the Temple of Judaism now has the right to tax everyone. And if you don't chip into the Temple of Judaism, well, then you're not really a communitarian, and we're going to send you to Jewish jail. So just because I don't want some people having the right to do something other people don't have the right to do, in no way disqualifies me from being a communitarian or someone who cares about the downtrodden. And when it comes to Marx not liking the state, he didn't have a principled opposition to the state. If communism is the abolition of private property, and what makes the state a unique institution is they have the right to initiate aggression against people and private property, well, then of course you can see how a state is completely compatible with communism. It necessarily aggresses against private property and private property claims between consenting adults. So I'm going back to my original claim. Mr. Armstrong has not justified why the government has double standards, whether it's in monopolizing the money supply or anything else that the Democratic Socialist would like them to do. He says I have the right to have a 1 in 300 million vote in America, but I don't have the right to take a job for less than whatever the state says the minimum wage is. If I am the worker and you want to empower me to do what's in my interest, offer me something better, educate me, tell me a million other things you can do voluntarily. Just don't coercively stop people from engaging in these exchanges. My point is, I advocate decriminalizing all capitalist acts between consenting adults. I believe I have explained that point both on the economic and moral realm. I don't believe Mr. Armstrong has justified or has made the argument that some people in government should be held to different moral standards, and therefore I believe his position is indefensible. That is my closing statement. Thank you so much for having me. And Dr. Armstrong, it has been such a pleasure.
Absolutely. Dr. Armstrong and Keith, it was a great pleasure to speak with you. Keith, where could people find you before you go?
Libertarianinstitute.org.
Libertarianinstitute.org. And don't forget, everybody, there is going to be a lot of great events coming up. We are going to have, on civil liberties, Chud Logic versus Astral Flight, where Astral Flight, who is much further right, is going to be talking about how certain civil liberties that we have today we actually don't need, and how society can function well without those. So that will be a very interesting episode of Chud Logic on the opposition there. And then we're going to have a gun control debate, Styx Hexenhammer 666 versus Jack Cacciarella. I hope I'm saying the surname correctly. And that should be a very fun episode as well. Very excited for that. That is 8 a.m. on June 14th, on Tuesday, June 14th, very early. And lastly, we are going to have Pax Americana, which is going to be a debate between Jeremy Kaufman, which, Keith, I know you know Jeremy, and Counterpoints, talking about the United States hegemony around the world as far as military bases, as far as military, all that stuff that we were talking about right now. We are going to get into the nitty-gritty of that. That is happening on Thursday, the 16th, 8 p.m. 8 p.m., pretty late. So once again, Keith, thank you so much. Dr. Armstrong, thank you so much. I look forward to having both of you guys back on BTR again. We're going to keep going with this. It's great fun. I really appreciate the time that you guys put into this. Mwah! Good night, everybody.
My
Take care,
pleasure,
gentlemen.
Great to see you.
Don't